And then Robin, I'll wait.
I'm Jenna. So just so everybody's aware, this meeting is being recorded, and I just want to offer a welcome to our work group members of the House Bill 5006 work group, as well as our other attendees, members of the public, and others who are listening in today and watching. Appreciate you all taking the time and being here. You'll maybe take note just quickly on the agenda that we are going to open up for public comment at 11:15. Thereabouts within a few minutes. So if you're a member of the public, you're very likely you are on the webinar side. And so you'll need to use your virtual hand raising. Jenna, my colleague from Oregon Consensus, and I can see hand raises on the webinar side. If you raise your hand indicating that you'd like to provide public comment, we'll know who's in the queue and we'll bring you forward when it's time. So feel free, if you are interested or know that you're planning to provide some public comment, you can show your virtual hand at this time or any point until we call for public comment. So just to kind of kick things off, I just want to, again, appreciate everybody being here. I want to just to tee up today's conversation. One of the things that we did last time, if you recall, we were in Bend on June 7th. And on the heels of that, our team, Oregon Consensus team, sent out a survey asking about kind of priority topics. And we had about a 70% response rate from our work group members indicating that there were some high priority topics. And so a lot of what is coming forward today is based on those survey results. I'll speak a little bit more to that in a moment, but I just want to tee this up. And then before I go any further, let's do a round of introductions of our work group members. So I'm just going to go through the Hollywood squares as I see them and just share with us who you are and who you're representing on the work group in this process. So let me start with JR.
Hi, JR Cook, Northeast Oregon Water Association, representing the rural water users. I can't remember, they're all kind of blending together, but thanks for having me.
Thank you. Daniel?
Daniel Newberry, Johnson Creek Watershed Council.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, Dan Thorndike, Oregon Business Council from live in Ashland, Medford, but calling in from the East Coast today.
Thank you. Holly?
Everyone, my name is Holly Mondo, and I am representing the Harney County Community-Based Water Planning Collaborative.
Thank you. Kristen.
Good morning, everyone. Kristen Rivard, I'm the Oregon Director of Trout Unlimited.
Thank you. Donna.
Donna Beveridge, convener of the Upper Grand Ronde Place-Based Planning in Eastern Oregon.
Thank you. Peggy?
Peggy Lynch, Natural Resources Coordinator for the League of Women Voters of Oregon, and we have a number of local leagues around the state.
Thank you. Margaret?
Margaret Magruder, Columbia County Commissioner, representing Association of Oregon Counties.
Thank you. Ileana?
Hi, I'm Ileana Alexander with the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Sayusala Indians. And I'm calling in from very sea foggy, very cold and overcast Coos Bay.
Thank you. Kate?
Hi, everybody. I am Kate Fitzpatrick, Executive Director of the Deschutes River Conservancy, representing a regional perspective on this working group.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Weigel from Oregon DEQ. I'm the Water Quality Administrator there. I'm also calling in from another time zone and have some other conflicts toward the end of this meeting. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave a little bit early, but thanks.
Thank you. Bobby.
Good morning, everyone. Bobby Bruno, General Manager of Natural Resources and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs.
you. Anton?
Good morning, Anton Kiono. I'm with the Department of Natural Resources for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation.
Thank you. Jason?
Good morning, Jason Fenton. I'm the Environmental Department Manager for the Burns Paiute Tribe.
Thank you. Kimberly?
Hi, everyone. Kimberly Priestley, Water Watch of Oregon.
Thank you. Courtney?
Good morning. Good morning. This is Courtney Warner Kroll. I'm representing the governor's office. I'm the water policy advisor.
Thanks, Courtney. Kaylin?
Good morning. Kaylin Barter, Oregon Water Policy Director, the Wild Salmon Center.
Thanks. Bob?
Good morning, Bob Reese with the Northwest Guides and Anglers Association and a professional fishing guide based in Astoria this time of year.
Thanks. Chandra?
Hi, good morning. Chandra Ferrari, representing Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm the Habitat Division Deputy Administrator. Thanks.
Thank you. Anna?
Hi, everybody. Anna Molina, she, her pronouns, with the Environmental Equity Committee, with the environmental justice perspective.
Thanks. Heather?
Heather Bartlett with the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians. I'm the environmental specialist and I am in Roseburg, Oregon. Thank you.
Thanks. Oriana?
My name is Oriana Maniera. I'm the Energy, Climate, and Transportation Manager at Verde.
Thank you. April?
Hello, I'm April Snell, Executive Director with the Oregon Water Resources Congress, which is a trade association representing irrigation districts and similar agricultural water suppliers delivering water to food and farms all over Oregon.
Thank you. Marianne? Marianne might still be on a call. We'll come back. Nikki?
Nikki Iverson, City of Hillsborough and Chair of the League of Oregon Cities Water Wastewater Policy Advisor.
Thank you. Tom?
Robin?
Yes.
Just so you know, for some reason, when I was trying to join the Outlook invite, it kept sending me to a PSU login page. So I had to go to the email. So I don't know if there's just a broken link or something there, but in case anyone else had that problem, it might just be me.
Okay, we'll check it out. Thank you for letting us know. Tom?
Good morning, everyone. Tom Byler, Director at the Oregon Water Resources Department.
Thank you. Lily?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lily Prawl. I'm the Regional Planning Coordinator for the Oregon Water Resources Department and providing staff support to this work group.
Thanks, Lily. Jenna?
Hi, everyone. Jenna Stillman, Project Associate with Oregon Consensus.
All right. Did I miss anyone? I think we got everybody. My name is Robin Harkless. I'm with Oregon Consensus, providing facilitation services to the work group. And again, welcome. So just a quick, again, back to the overview for today. The primary focus for this conversation today is, given the survey results, we learned that the kind of top priority topics that work group members who completed the survey said would be important to address in this process were related to data, community and public engagement, pre-planning phase of the system, and planning to action. These were kind of the top hits from the survey. So OWRD took the lion's share of developing a draft product for pre-planning and plan to action, which will be kind of the bulk of today's focus and conversation. The other two items will be brought forward in September. You'll hear a quick status update from the engagement task group who is working on that piece. And in September, you'll hear from DEQ and potentially some of the other water state agencies who will talk about a data management project. Jennifer, I won't put you on the spot, but when we do our status updates later today, if you want to say anything more about that, we'll welcome you in. All right, so I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the flow of the conversation today, but I do want to turn it over to Tom to just sort of talk a little bit about how the WRD process for developing the framework that you'll be presenting today.
Thanks, Robin. I want to talk a little bit about this. I also want to I think I talked about this at the Bend meeting a little bit, but I want to get it out just briefly for folks for your situational awareness that we have a legislative concept at the department that we have brought that we've been working on for some time associated with place-based planning, which we've all talked about as a form of kind of regional planning. That authority sunsets at the end of this biennium. And so we've been expecting for some time now to have a vehicle to keep that authority alive and to continue that program. So I wanted folks to be aware that we do have a legislative concept. Some of you have been working directly with us on that concept. And for those of you that have, you know that there's some overlapping conversation that's occurred, and which is understandable given it's a very similar topic. I just want folks to know that it's not our intention to create confusion with this, the fact that we have that legislative concept. We are, continue to be fully engaged with this group, and we're very hopeful and optimistic that this group can develop ideas that can inform the 2023 legislative session around these kind of broader ideas around regional planning that we're engaged in. At the same time, we intend to continue to hold on to that legislative concept and preserve our options going forward as a potential vehicle for continuing that conversation in 2023. So I just wanted folks to be aware of that going forward. And Robin, are we ready to start launching into the framework or the framing discussion?
No, I think that was right, just to make that distinction for folks before we go into the conversation today. And I think before we do that, let's take a pause because we did create some space for public comment. So Jenna, do we have anyone in the queue that wanted to that we know of that wants to provide comment at this time?
Not that I've seen via Zoom webinar. Oh, here we go. Not that I've seen via Zoom webinar or email, but it does look like Nikki has her hand raised.
Okay, but no public comment that we know of?
No, not that I'm seeing.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Nikki.
I just thought with Tom's comments, I'm just a little confused because I thought we were here kind of trying to work on place-based planning, and I understand that our county commissioner had some thoughts on that, and I just thought maybe you guys could clarify whether we can actually bring proposals forward ourselves, or if that has to be funneled through the department. Or I was just a little confused on what's going on there. And Tom, I don't think you really addressed the elephant in the room there.
I wasn't trying to, wasn't thinking there was a huge elephant in there, but I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more. This group, in my mind, and this is really up to you all, has the ability to make recommendations to the legislature, to the next governor, around regional planning and management. As you all know, we've been talking about a kind of a solar system of issues around this, and we're hoping today to start narrowing our focus. Place-based planning could be an element of that. It could be a form of regional planning. Doesn't have to be. This group could go in a different direction. In any event, this group, if it wants to make legislative recommendations, can do so. But it will rely on either legislative committee, legislators, perhaps the next governor, or a state agency to be able to move a concept forward. But it all depends on timing. For our agency, in order to preserve our options, we had to commit down a path that it was quite ahead of where this work group is with respect to the development of your ideas, because of the way the state process is for developing legislative concepts. We had to have our ideas in by, I think, May of the spring. So they don't line up really well, but that concept is out there. And I'll just use this as an example, this is just a big if, but if this group develops consensus recommendations and wants to pursue legislation, there is the possibility that going forward into the legislative session, that, for example, if our legislative concept gets dropped as a bill and the relating to clause is sufficient, that you could do a gut and stuff to allow for the concepts of this group to move forward in that bill. I'm definitely open to that possibility, but I just think we need more time to see how things play out. We need to see where this group goes. But I think that's just one example of how this could play out and become a legislative a bill essentially in front of the legislature next year. There are other alternative options as well, as I mentioned, where either individual legislators or legislative committees, and I know Representative Helm and Representative Owens have signaled their interest in this issue. So I think this group will have some folks out there who will be able to move ideas forward through bills going forward. But at this point, it's a little premature for us to get too focused on that, because we've got some time to work through these issues.
Peggy.
So I just wanted to make sure, and Tom actually took care of most of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to make sure that for many of us who believe that some form of place-based planning or regional planning is really important to move forward, it was positive to have the agency provide a vehicle. And most of you on this call understand the legislative process. And so just because there is a vehicle out there that the agency has provided, that vehicle can change over time. What to me is also really important is it relates to a planning fund. And so it is, I think those of us who would like to see some form of this kind of planning move forward want to make sure that there is an ongoing fund to make that happen. So thanks.
Thank you. All right, so let's.
I'm sorry, but I guess my concern's just I'm just concerned about stifling people's ideas. And if we're just coming here to talk and then we're all going to go do our own thing in the legislature, this is a lot of time for me to spend because I'm not saying we'd all agree to Commissioner Magruder's proposal, but I think what I'm concerned about, what's creating some trust issues for me, is that it was stifled with sharing with the group. So then they have to go and share outside. And I just don't know, like, what are we doing here if we're not really talking about that, Tom? That's what, if we're just going to take your stuff and then go fight amongst the legislature like this, I'm just going to be frank, this is a bit of a waste of time, in my opinion. So maybe today is not the day to share proposals, but if we're not going to share ideas, that's what I'm concerned about. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I think
that's what I'm concerned about.
I would like to speak to that from a process perspective, but I see two of our coordinating committee members also have their hands up and might be able to speak to this as well. So I'll go Kaylin and Oriana.
Thanks, Robin. I think we're daylighting some significant information asymmetry here, where my guess is everybody on the call doesn't know what Nikki's talking about. And it would be really helpful, I think, for all of us to have the same understanding. And if there's if there's another proposal that's out there, that has not been shared with the work group. I don't think that any of us have ever had the intent of stifling ideas. We have all tried to create a safe and equitable and productive space for ideas to come forward. We've also all tasked Water Resources Department with coming up with a straw man for us to react to, because we realized that we were swimming in the abstract. So those are my initial reactions here. I do think I'd love to hear from Oriana, and then Robin, your comment about bringing this back to a process feels very like a good direction to go.
Okay, go ahead, Oriana.
Yeah, I'll just give context for kind of what went on in the coordinating committee in advance of this, and maybe share a little bit more what Kaylin was alluding to. Commissioner Magruder brought forward a potential proposal. She was very proactive in that regard, which I think is a very good thing in this space. But as a coordinating committee, we had some conversations about making sure that other members of this work group understood that they could bring forward proposals too. And I think I'll just be transparent that I raised the concern about bringing that proposal forward now without the opportunity to first discuss the WRD proposal, and also to give other folks the opportunity to share proposals all at the same time, so that one proposal wasn't necessarily getting there first, as much as anyone who has an idea understands that they have the opportunity to share that, and that can be shared at the same time, but potentially in the same framework, so that we can better understand the different ideas in kind of the same language or structure. So my sincere apologies if that has caused the impression that something was being stifled there. I think at least the concerns I raised in the coordinating committee were focused just on good process and making sure that there's an opportunity for anyone in the work group to share an idea, and for that to happen at the same time, and to happen perhaps in response to the WRD proposal, instead of suggesting that perhaps that space had been closed. And my concern was that that might have been an impression for some folks, especially folks who haven't been maybe as actively engaged in this space, that there is still opportunity. So with all due respect to Commissioner Magruder, I think I'm still hopeful to have that proposal come before this body. I know others on the coordinating committee are as well. I think there was just a pause to make sure that we got the timing right and gave that opportunity for others as well.
And I want to clarify just before that the proposal still has not been shared with the coordinating committee, so we don't know what the proposal is. It is a proposal in concept, but we don't know, we have not seen it. And it's unclear who has seen it at this point.
So I'm just going to quickly intervene for a moment and say, yes, this was a big topic of conversation with the coordinating committee about timing and sequencing and fairness of process to bring ideas forward. Kimberly pointed out in the chat that we will be talking explicitly about the opportunity going forward, and an invitation to work group members to bring ideas forward, compelling the rest of the group in a collaborative spirit to kind of compel people to work with you and get some agreements. That's the whole point of this collaborative endeavor, is to see where you can find some alignment and maybe come up with joint proposals that would be beneficial to future decision makers, potentially making ideas and concepts more durable and lasting if they've come through a agreement in a diverse group of interests, like at this work group. So there will be an opportunity, Nikki, and I think to everyone's kind of conversation so far, not everybody has seen this, but everybody knows what we're talking about. And the assignment was for WRD to hold the pen and put some of these ideas on paper for people to react to. And then following that would be an invitation for us to figure out how do we bring additional individual ideas forward, so that at the end of the day, we're not kind of wrestling with a bunch of competing proposals. But I think as one of the comments you were expressing, Nikki, is, you know, we can do that through other forums. This is a place for us to try to come together on joint ideas and recommendations. And so laying that foundation through the work that WRD has been really working so hard on behalf of the whole group to provide today, I would just respectfully ask that we make sure that we use the time today to look through that, and then really address additional needs and interests about how do we bring proposals forward and create that explicit space after today. So it's kind of both and, if I may put that into the conversation.
That's really helpful. I think Oriana's characterization of it was also helpful, that we bring it forward. I was concerned the way that Tom laid it out, that we'll have a legislative process to talk about other people's ideas. So that's what set an alarm bell off for me, because really, you know, if that's what we're going to do, then we don't need to have these conversations. But if we're going to have an open space at a future meeting where people can bring their proposals, then I think that's a much better process. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mary Ann and Margaret, and then I think we should move forward with content today.
Yeah, I'm very happy to move forward, Robin. I just want to kind of, for the record, I'm on the coordinating committee, but the conversations about not putting forward, not having time on this agenda and not putting it forward came after the coordinating committee. So I just want to say it wasn't discussed by the group at large. I don't have terribly strong feelings on when it was talked about either way, but I will say I don't like the characterization that the coordinating committee said now is not the time, and then people are saying, oh, we haven't even seen it. I think it was because Margaret was told now is not the time. So that just feels like a bit of a tough characterization for me. I don't think anybody should be raising that as a concern that, oh, we haven't seen it, and now, you know, we don't know who's seen it, because the reason that we haven't seen it is that we after the fact, Margaret was told that she couldn't bring it forward. And so, you know, she's going to have the conversation she's going to have with that. And I mean, I don't think we can control A, other people's conversations, but B, I think it is the ad hoc decision made by the coordinating committee is the reason no one has seen it. And so I don't want that characterization to stand as like Margaret was not being forthcoming about it, because I think she's been nothing but forthcoming about it. And she was told now is not your moment. So that's what I have to say on that.
I don't think I could get a better marketing approach for my concept than what's happening right now. I'm thinking that everybody's on the edge of their seat wondering what in the hell did that old gal put forward. But I do want to say that I do have concerns about process. The coordinating committee met, and I had talked to Robin and said, I have this concept I would like to put forward. We took the idea to the coordinating committee. The coordinating committee said, fine, okay, we'll put it on the agenda. And then after that meeting, it started, I've thought about it a little bit. Somebody says, and I don't agree. And then people, several other people on the coordinating committee piled on. I would have appreciated it if, you know, we maybe had another meeting and talked about it at least. I thought that the process was poorly done. Maybe I don't understand a working group, but I thought we, you know, talked about ideas. The other thing that strikes me is process. So whether or not the coordinating committee works on a consensus process or not, I think I need to have that confirmed or not confirmed, what the coordinating committee process is. And then also I think that I'm a little concerned about the work group process and consensus. If does it have to be 100% consensus? Does it, I mean, if we do a 1 to 5, does 1 5 vote throw it all off? I don't know. I think that that the process has been a bit confusing, and I find it very interesting that our conveners are really kind of looked at as not part of the process. I think Representative Helm and Representative Owens are essential to the process. They have not only have they signaled their interest in doing something about water planning in the state, they have been very active. So I'm finding a little bit of confusion as to their role. And I was also told that I really shouldn't share information or talk to them. And I found that a little interesting too, since they are elected officials in the state of Oregon. I wasn't sure that there should be a limitation on my conversations with them.
So I'm gonna try to put a little process wraparound on this. It has not been easy or perfect. The coordinating committee has been trying to do their best and do right by the group to kind of set up agendas and follow a process that I think ultimately everyone is feeling like the principle of fairness, the principle of equity, those are important things around this process that have been voiced as important. And it's not perfect. And so that's all true. And what we have today is that WRD, based on the conversations of the work group back in June and even prior to that, based on the survey we did, and actually based on the coordinated committee actually having one consensus choice, which was we should give WRD the pen to put some things on paper for us as a work group to respond to, because it was feeling very sort of scattershot and just a lot of sort of brainstorming conversation that we now need to sort of tether into something that you could respond to. So that's really the charge that they took for today. And that's the charge that we have set up for today's agenda. And I think in service to the folks that have been working so hard to develop this product, Lily being primary on that, I think we owe it to her and to all of you to engage in that conversation for this meeting today. That being said, I also want to acknowledge that there are ideas out there, whether they're in the form of ideas, proposals, formal or informal. We need to create a channel for people to bring those forward. And that is something that the coordinating committee began to speak to. And it is something that we are now carving out as an explicit opportunity for people that I'd love to talk to you all about before the end of today's conversation. But with respect to the work that's been developed for today on your behalf, I would suggest that we move into that content space. And then we'll come back at the end to talk about what are the next steps for individuals that want to bring ideas forward that may or may not nest within or align with the ideas that emerge out of the draft ideas that the WRD is bringing forward today and that you all are hopefully going to be talking about today. And I know it doesn't feel great, but I think we do owe ourselves, you owe yourselves a chance to at least dive into some of the content and see where your interests and needs might align. That's really what we're looking for in this conversation. And that's the sort of hope and promise of a consensus building endeavor. So with that, I am going to turn it over to the WRD team and invite you to share what you have produced on behalf of the work group.
Thanks, Robin. Appreciate everyone's input and interest in opportunity to engage and concerns about process. That's good that folks are paying attention to that. My hope is that today you'll be able to start diving deep and putting some of your ideas out there. What we try to do with this, you received a framing draft. It's entitled Framing for State-Supported Regional Water Planning and Management in Oregon. Lily did a great job of putting this together. She's going to step you through it in a little detail, but I want to just say a few remarks to help kind of set the table for this document and our thought process around it and what we hope it stimulates for this group today and going forward. As we wrestled with the task that you gave us to develop a straw proposal, we went through a lot of different thoughts, and I'll have to say that the previous conversations of this work group have been very robust, and but it's also been kind of all over the place in terms of how you can look at a system that can support regional planning and the work that might precede that and the work that follows that, all very important. And so we put a lot of thought into how can we create a tool that can help the group get its focus, prioritize its efforts, and then start to dive more deeply into the detail, which I think many of you are interested in doing. So that was the hope that and desire and intention of this document. Was we don't go into a lot of detail. That's not our intention. That's the work group's responsibility and opportunity. But what we're hoping we can do is remind you of the 5 phases of regional planning that we've talked about. The pre-planning phase, the planning, the moving a plan to action, the project implementation, and then the monitoring and adaptive work. And we're focusing on 2 areas today, the pre-planning and moving a plan to action. So that is going to be, one of the things that I hope that you have in front of you during the conversation today is the diagram, and Lily will step you through this, but there's a diagram that we put together that helps kind of look at that system of those 5 phases. And again, we'll be talking in more detail about 2 of those today, but that's something the work group has talked about, and we want folks to be thinking about that, because if you build recommendations, if you are looking at ideas on how to have a state-supported system, those are the building blocks in our view, based on us listening to this group thus far. And the details of those, I think, are really the critical questions. So as we go through this conversation, the first threshold that we want folks to be thinking about, and that we'll want to pause a little bit and have some conversation around, is we built in some assumptions, and there's a list in the framing draft of a number of assumptions that we built into this that we want to check in with you on to see if you're thinking in the same way. And I think Robin will guide us through that exercise. And we'll allow for some questions around that, or if there are any red flags around that, or if we're missing anything, that I think this will be an opportunity for us to check in on that. But then we'll go into options and scenarios, both around the pre-planning phase and the moving a plan to action phase. And if you've had a chance to review the document, you'll see a table in there, and the table is it's not we're not recommending anything. We're setting it up there to kind of create a menu for you to think about in terms of the characteristics or the services that are going to be important to you associated with pre-planning or moving a plan to action, and who supports those services. Are these things that the state should do? Is it something that could be done locally? I think we want to kind of frame those issues up and start to build the infrastructure, the skeleton around these ideas, and hear from you today about areas of interest, areas maybe that you're not interested in, and areas in particular that you think deserve and where it needs more definition or exploration. I think that's really some of the key takeaways today. We hope that as an exercise, you can go through, as we go through each of these, the pre-planning and the moving a plan to action. We'll step you through the items to consider. And we're hoping that you'll have then a chance to kind of go through a group exercise in terms of what you see as the priorities, what you see the state's role should be, and as a part of this 5-phase system that we're contemplating for today's purposes. I want to emphasize at the outset that this is not intended to replace anything that currently exists in terms of grant programs and planning functions that exist currently. This is really around developing a system around regional planning and regional integrated planning. So that is kind of the broader concept that we're trying to carry forward. And I think I'll pass the baton to Lily, who will step you through this in a little more detail, and then we'll have some time for questions.
And just before you do that, Lily, I want to welcome Adam, just joined us. Adam, we're just going to do quick intros. Who are you and who are you representing on the work group?
Thank you. Sorry I'm late, everyone. My name is Adam Devinger. I am the General Manager for Seal Rock Water District, and I am representing Special Districts Association of Oregon on this.
Thank you. And Kathleen?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tribal Councilwoman Kathleen George with Grand Ronde Tribe. Sorry, I had to start late this morning. I had a doctor's appointment, but it's good to see you all here.
Thank you. And Jeff?
A very tardy Jeff Stone, Oregon Association of Nurseries. I'm a terrible scheduler.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Okay, go ahead, Lily.
Lily, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
I was trying to find the unmute button. I got it now. Hopefully y'all can see my screen. Okay, great. So thanks, Tom, for sort of framing that up for us. I'm going to just walk you through the document that got sent out in a little bit more detail, just so that we're all sort of on the same page as we enter our discussions later today. So as Tom mentioned, there are two sort of sections in the document. There's the conceptual framing, which is a list of 10 assumptions, A through J. And then there's the second section, which is options and scenarios, which we've built out for pre-planning and moving a plan to action. And hopefully we'll get to both of those today, and then moving on to the other phases at later meetings. So to start with, I'm going to go through that list of assumptions. So in order to develop those options and scenarios, we needed to lay the groundwork with some fundamental assumptions about the system. These assumptions are based on the work and discussions of the group so far, along with the list of essential elements that was created for the June meeting that was based in previous planning work in the state, including place-based planning, the IWRS, and the 100-year water vision. So I'm going to go over these assumptions fairly quickly, and then we're going to take a pause and see if there's any of these assumptions that you want to flag, if there's any major issues with them, or if there's ones that we need to dive deeper into or have more discussions around at a later date. So let's see. The first assumption is that the system that we're talking about is made up of 5 phases. The first of these phases is a pre-planning phase. Coming out of that pre-planning phase might be multiple different pathways and frameworks. So a pre-planning phase could lead to a need for more community capacity building or recognition of that need, or it might lead to a recognition that other types of planning might be more appropriate. But what we're going to be assuming, our assumption is that this group is going to be focusing on the next phase of the system would be regional basin integrated water resources planning. And following that, there's a third phase of moving the plan to action, which we've talked a little bit about. We're going to dive deeper into later today, followed by a fourth phase of project implementation, which sort of coincides with that moving the plan to action phase. And then finally, a fifth phase of monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation, which sort of brings things around to phases 2, 3, and 4. Other assumptions that we made were that the regional plan will be developed at a watershed or basin scale. The planning process will be transparent, inclusive, collaborative, with a balanced representation of water interests. That the planning process will be voluntary and community initiated and led in partnership with the state. Just to flag, this assumption is also being talked a lot about in the community engagement task group that is happening right now. And so they'll be providing some more definition around it in the future. The planning process will involve strong public participation and community engagement. The planning process will be informed by the best available data, and we'll be talking more about data at the September meeting. The approach to planning will be integrated and based on the goal of better understanding and meeting in-stream and out-of-stream water needs now and in the future, including water quantity, water quality, and ecosystem needs. That the state agencies will serve as active partners throughout the phases of water planning and implementation. That the planning process will be guided by the principles in the state's integrated water resources strategy and the 100-year water vision. And finally, that this approach to water planning is not intended to replace existing programs or paths for water resources planning and implementation, that it will be non-regulatory, consistent with state laws and policy, and will not jeopardize existing water rights. So those are the 10 assumptions. So I'm going to turn it back to Robin to facilitate to see if there's any major concerns or flags for further discussion that you all might want to consider.
Can you guys go back to the assumptions just so we can
see them?
Just for a minute. Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And just to be clear, we'll flag any major concerns for more follow-up conversation. We also aren't looking to wordsmith these in the moment. I know we've had lots of conversations about, the words matter and getting that matters. And this is sort of in principle, these assumptions that we're sort of asking about, are there major red flags or uncertainties around these principles? So we'll go to Kimberly and then Margaret, Commissioner Magruder.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to flag for future discussion. It's sort of it's somewhat captured in both D and H, primarily D. And I think there have been conversations around who leads these since the concept was first discussed back in 2012. You know, some of the documentations, like the Integrated Water Resources Strategy, has the state facilitating and directing. And I think it's just one of, and it's, you know, it has been brought up in the place-based planning assessment as well. You know, the need for further discussion about who is sort of directing / leading and also who is facilitating. So I guess I would raise as a topic, we certainly need community engagement, but I would like to discuss the intersection between the phrase community initiated and led with the direction in other documents, and also flags in the place-based planning assessment about maybe a more rigorous state role in facilitation and or leadership. And or another concept that was raised was professional facilitation.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna also say that some of that around sort of defining community led is a topic that the engagement task group is working on. So that's something they will have been given some more thought to as well. And then even some of the items within your comment, Kimberly, may emerge in the discussion today as we're looking at some of the different activities and roles of the state in the pre-planning and the planning to action phase. So I'll just ping that as potential for more discussion even today on the actual concepts or framework, should I say.
Yeah, and just one more framing piece just to add to it is, you know, the discussions, it was very purposeful, the framing of this program as place-based, because it is about, you know, the watershed, the basin. So just want to add that for context.
Thank you. Margaret.
I'm not exactly sure what you want in here. I have concerns with most all of those assumptions. I think E, G, and J are the least of concerns to me, but I don't know that you want me to go through all of the rest of my concerns. But I would flag all of the other assumptions other than perhaps E, G, and J.
Can you give us a hint about what those concerns are?
Sure, absolutely. I can. Well, I guess A, I can don't have real concerns about that. B, watershed or basin scale. I have personally been working on a county scale or a multiple county scale, and that doesn't seem to be acceptable. C, I'm concerned about the balanced representation of water interests. There needs to be somebody who's kind of driving the bus, and generally that falls to people who are elected, either county, city, state, somebody who has some true accountability. D, led in partnership with the state. I'm not exactly sure what partnership with the state entails. F, the planning process will be informed by best available data. I think it needs to be also informed by identifying all of the data gaps that we have, and that state agencies should be compelled to help us on the local basin, whatever words we use. to have the data that we need to make good decisions. And I don't think that the state agencies perhaps have all the data necessary for that. State agencies will serve on H as active partners. I'm not sure what an active partner means. Will they be responding to our data gap needs? Will they, I just had a problem with that. And I don't think on the 100-year water vision, I've participated in 100-year water vision conversations when they first started. I'm not sure whether the 100-year water vision is it set in administrative rules. I guess I'd need to spend a little bit more time on knowing how we will use it as a guide. That's it.
Okay, so it sounds like some of these are, you know, what does that actually mean when we're looking at the system? Some of that is what I'm hearing from you, Margaret. So I would challenge everyone to see in the conversation today about how you set up and structure the system, how that gets represented, these assumptions get represented, and whether or not it meets the goals that you have for some of these assumptions. So we've flagged them for sure, and we may need to revisit with if folks are feeling strongly that we need to have some better definition. But it might actually come through the development of your concepts or framework ideas. So Peggy, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, Margaret, that was complete, and I did take notes. I had 3 comments. One is around A, and item number 4 says project implementation. I know that one of the things that everybody in the place-based planning group wanted to make sure that when they did the work, they got something out of the work that they got done. But I don't know if the word project is the right thing. So you have moving a plan to action, and then I guess I would substitute action implementation rather than project, because project implies that there will be some specific thing that will happen, an entity that will be provided. So I have some concerns about that one. And on B, I just had a question about watershed or basin scale. I certainly want to make sure it's within a certain amount of water, but I don't know if those 2 definitions are exactly correct, or if it's too big, and if there's a smaller subset of that that is still part of regional planning. And I don't have an expertise on that. And then on G, although you do talk about water needs now and into the future, including water quantity, water quality, and ecosystem needs, I guess I would add and changing climate, because that is so important. Even though you do say into the future, I want to just put a pin on the changing climate part. Otherwise, thanks for the work. I really appreciate it. A good start.
Thanks, Peggy. Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. And I can see a lot of work has gone into putting this together. I guess a question I have really is brought up by Jay, the last one here. And that is, I've had this kind of question the whole time we've been coming to these meetings to ask this question: what exactly is the decision space of this group? And what exactly are we allowed to recommend? And when I look at Jay, it seems to me like there isn't that much decision space for recommending anything. And on another hand, I've heard people in this meeting say, hey, we're free to make recommendations to the legislature for changing laws or whatever, and that type of thing. And I'm just thinking that if everything that goes into J is true and nothing can really change in terms of policy and what we're offering, I would think any ideas would have been implemented years ago. it seems to me like I would like a little bit more detail about what exactly our decision space here is in this group. Thanks.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Tom. Do you want to say anything about that particular assumption?
Yeah. So Daniel, thank you for that question. And I want to make sure that we distinguish the work group and our effort and our opportunity to make recommendations around policy issues to the governor and the legislature as being different than the assumptions that we have listed here that are applying to the planning efforts. So first of all, I want to draw a big line between those. The assumption in J has no bearing, nor was it intended to direct to the ability of this group to make recommendations. I think that's wide open in terms of where you want to go. So that's one part of this. The work group, these assumptions were not intended to inform the work group process. It was really directed towards this model and system that we're contemplating around regional planning. One of the issues that's come up around regional planning over time is the question of, well, what does it mean to be regional? Who has the authority to do things? And you'll note in the authority to create this work group that it was the Regional Planning and Management Work Group. There's been a lot of conversation about what does management mean? And one of the things that that I think we've heard from some work group members, and I know from my standpoint, is that these regional planning efforts are not intended to shift jurisdictional responsibility from one entity to another. That's not the starting point for this. I think, so speaking for myself, the state has responsibility of managing water rights. This is not intended to delegate that responsibility to local folks. This is a planning effort. It's not a administrative enforcement responsibilities. So we're trying to kind of create the box within which people are working with from the planning standpoint. Now, that said, when we move into the conversation around moving a plan to action, you'll see that policy recommendations or policy changes may be an outcome of the planning process. And we see that happen a lot. We've seen it happen in Central Oregon. We've seen it happen in the Harney Basin, where they realize, okay, now we understand our situation much better. We understand the water situation, surface water and groundwater. We understand what our needs are going forward. And we've got a plan of action to try to move forward on. And you know what? Things don't quite fit. So that is the point in which I think it's reasonable for a planning effort to start working with local officials. It depends on whether it's a local ordinance that needs to be changed, state law, or maybe some federal issues to try to help move their ideas and goals under their plan forward. That's the stage where I think the door is open for that kind of conversation, but it's not assumed into the early stages of planning. So I hope that was helpful. I hope I didn't confuse things more.
I think that clarifies a lot of my question, not all. What I'm thinking of is, in particular, it seems like on one hand, what we're doing here, maybe all the decisions we're looking at making are, what's the definition of the geography of the different groups or different basins, and how much money is each group going to get, and what it's going to take for each group to get access to that money. And then we push everything off to the groups and do it like that. And then there's this other thing that you're talking about, and I absolutely do not think it's a good idea to try to delegate any responsibility for water law to the groups. I'm totally with you on that. But what I'm thinking, Tom, and maybe we're on the same page here, is that, I'm sure as part of this creativity that's going to go on based on the different situations in the different basin, that people might say, hey, I think we might need a little bit of flexibility here. You know, as long as at this point there's 10 CFS of water minimum, can we go off and have some flexibility in how we make sure that gets met? Those kinds of things that they might want to suggest. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we should kind of let them roll out some of the different variations of how the system might get set up. You know, we're starting with this kind of pre-planning piece, so it might not get fully at your question, Daniel, but we will move into that other piece of it, and maybe have some conversations about the variations within which there might be opportunity and what outcomes might come from a planning endeavor and toward action. I think to me, it sounds linked even to what Peggy was suggesting earlier, which is how you shape the idea of what the outcome is might look different across different planning areas. But going into the planning process, there's not an assumption that the group is making changes to law or policy. That's kind of what I'm hearing in a nutshell. But we do need to have more conversation about what the system, how it's structured, and what it looks like. Kimberly, is it pressing, or could we move on? Or
it's not. I can put it in a chat.
Okay, let's get into it. So Lily, I'm going to give you the floor, and let's talk through the pre-planning scenarios.
Okay. So let's move on. Sorry, I just need to get my three screens set up. Okay. So diving into sort of the options and scenarios. The first thing I want to do is just give you a brief overview of how we developed that table 1 and table 2 in the framing draft that we sent out. For those of you that are listening in, that framing draft is also available on our website, so you can download it there. So through work group conversations and research, a few key questions emerged that helped us build out these options and scenarios. Those questions are, what activities would the state support for local planning groups to do and for state agencies to do? Another question was, what outcomes would result from those state-supported activities? And then finally, what are the connections to the next phase or phases of these activities or these outcomes? So once we had those questions lined up, we developed a menu of options to answer them based on what the work group has talked about so far. And then to build it out one step further, we developed 3 hypothetical scenarios that put different options together to help understand how each phase might look based on different levels of investment from the state. These scenarios are really just illustrations to help spur thinking and discussion about how you all want to build up options into your own scenario as a work group. And Robin will facilitate that after I get through this. So let's see, moving on. I'm going to start by describing the 3 scenarios we developed for pre-planning, and associated with each one of these scenarios is a menu of options, which you'll see outlined in the table 1. And we'll dive deeper into the next slide into what those options are. But just as a brief overview for pre-planning, the first scenario is full support for a pre-planning program. So the legislature would appropriate funding to a state agency to help set up a pre-planning program. And that would include grant funds for local planning groups and funding for agency program staff. The second scenario is more of middle of the road in terms of state support. In this scenario, the legislature would appropriate funding to state agencies to develop situational assessment, or rubric, which is something that's come up a lot in the place-based planning evaluation. Local planning groups could use this rubric to better understand whether they're ready to engage in regional integrated water resources planning. And then the third scenario is minimal state support. It would be direct appropriations to local planning groups, sort of at an ad hoc basis with no additional expectations for state agencies. So diving in a little bit deeper into what the menu of options are for each of these scenarios. This slide is looking at scenario 1 specifically. So this scenario would include support for all of the options. So that's support to local planning groups for convening and facilitating for community engagement, for a situational assessment. In the document, Table 1 has more detail about what a situational assessment might include, but that might be something that the work group would want to dive into through our discussions. But what we proposed were a high-level review of existing data to understand the status of water resources, a survey of existing plans and planning resources, community interest in a readiness evaluation, and then a determination of what interests and groups will sit at the table, including state and federal agencies. State agencies would administer pre-planning grants, provide technical support in the form of compiling foundational data and analyses, developing training materials, and developing educational workshops for local planning groups. The state would also develop criteria or metrics for situational assessment to understand what path the planning group should take out of the pre-planning phase and review whether the group is ready to move on to regional integrated water resources planning or if a different pathway might be appropriate. And then the outcomes of this phase would be a determination of what path the planning group is ready for, and then commitments would be made from an initial group of planning members. The second scenario would include funding for state agencies to develop the criteria and metrics for a situational assessment and resources to review those situational assessments, but would not provide support for local planning groups or any technical support from the state. In this scenario, local planning groups would be responsible for funding and doing situational assessments based on the rubric provided by the state. And then the outcome would be that the rubric would assess whether a group is ready for planning or regional integrated water resources planning, and not necessarily what pathways would be more appropriate. And then in this scenario, we would expect that there would also be commitments made from initial planning group members. And then finally, the third scenario is that minimal state support that I described, and this would just be ad hoc funding for local planning groups to convene and do their own assessment about whether they are ready to move on to the planning phase. We would also expect from this phase that there would be commitments from initial planning group members, but there wouldn't be that rubric provided by the state to understand what the next phase would be for the planning group. And then finally, the last question we asked when we were developing out the pre-planning phase was what the connection to the planning phase might look like. I think we're planning to talk about this connective tissue later at our next meeting in August, when we have a chance to talk about that phase 3 planning in greater depth. But I just wanted to bring it up because it's in your document, and briefly go over some options that we developed here. The 3 options that we have listed are that the completion of a pre-planning phase would either automatically qualify you for funding for integrated water resources planning, or that it would provide you a competitive advantage for that funding, or that there really is no advantage in doing it except for knowing that you're ready to move on. And with that, I think, yeah, that's my last slide. So I will open it up for questions.
Go ahead, Jeff. I saw your hand up earlier.
So thanks. And one of my deep, dark secrets is that I was a chief of staff at Metro, the regional planning agency. So if you sensed evil, yeah, that's true. I know that we paid a lot of attention to the pre-planning part at our in-person meeting. And I think understanding and quantifying how many need that help for pre-planning is an important step to really kind of undergo. What I unfortunately see is a whole bunch of loading on the pre-planning side when I think that's rolled up in a lot of just the planning writ large, right? So I just would caution additional complexity where it may or may not be not needed. But I think that if the state was a resource tool, so those who are not starting from a bare cupboard have the ability to have an equal chance to put something together so they're on a successful path. Because I look to Margaret and others in the counties, some are more ready than others, right? Some are better than others. And I think we want to try to make sure that they know how, not what we want them to plan. Because I think the local engagement early is going to be a successful indicator when you get to the project level. I do like the fact that if you participate in the planning side, that there's a carrot at the very end, some implementation dollars or some funding apparatus, but then we can get high centered on that rock quite quickly. But I just worry about it being overly complex and people just throw their hands up and say it's just going to be too much damn work for something that I'm not assured I'm going to get. So just a rambling old man soliloquy.
Dan? Oh, you're still on mute.
Got off the one, but not the other. Yeah, I really like the work product and the basic concept from a pretty high level. And I have opinions as to which scenario I think makes sense and all that, but I guess I'm a little lost and I'm not sure where this fits in the discussion of how the pre-planning part gets triggered. I mean, I guess really it comes down to how we define who or what is a local planning group that can trigger this process to start realizing from the pre-planning to the planning, you may be fleshing out who should be participating in identifying folks and everything, but it's not really evident to me who would have the ability to kick off the process. And again, I like the comments. Obviously, some basins and watersheds are very prepared, I'm sure, to jump into this. Others aren't. There's a wide range there, but maybe just I'm not sure when we might discuss that question of like, how does this actually get triggered under this framework, under this this particular kind of concept.
Okay, I'm going to flag Dan to your question. One, we do very much want to hear from the work group on where do you think the sweet spot, because she's laying out of kind of variations across. And so that is a primary question for the group to look at today is you said, I know where I would want to land. We want to hear that from work group members today. So that question. The other one around who initiates, I think that is a question we're going to flag, and it may be something that this group decides that's a piece that needs a little bit more definition or detail. And so let's see if we can get the scaffolding, and then also see if that's an important question that this work group should try to answer in this process. So I'm going to flag that as a potential. Okay. So Kimberly, Nikki, and Anton.
I guess I just had a question or maybe a comment, and maybe it's more appropriate when we get into the discussion later, but I guess in looking at the division between the local planning groups and the state agencies, I think it might be worth discussing whether some of the situational assessment work better falls within the Water Resources Department. I was looking at that assessment document that the Water Resources Department sent out a while back, which thank you, by the way. And it was clear from the assessment of the place-based planning that it seems like there was a strong desire for pre-planning. But my reading of that was that a lot of that, I think people wanted that from the state so that it would save them time. So for instance, like a pre-packaging of data and analysis needed for planning development, guidelines, identification of gaps. And so and maybe I'm just reading your chart wrong, but it seems to me like some of that, like the high level review of existing data to understand the status of water resources is under the local planning group activity. And it seems like the state would do that and then bring it to the local group for discussion. And I may just be not understanding the order, but that's just maybe something to think about.
Lily, was that something that within these different scenarios you would be clarified, is kind of the assumption of the state's role in developing that situational assessment across these variations?
I think it's a question. I think there are, yeah, it's a question for the work group to deliberate on. I think it could go under either, or there could be aspects of the situational assessment that the local planning group would do or the state would do in partnership with one another.
Okay. Nikki and Anton.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous that we're being a little too granular on what planning is. You know, if I was a legislator and I had to cut a piece of funding and I was looking at this from pre-planning or planning, I would definitely cut the pre-planning. So I think what we should do, and I just think that's a reality of what's going to happen if we split those out. I think inherently they're all different. They're all planning. It's just like phase 1 or 2. And I think if we combine it all into planning and funding for planning, maybe a phase 1 or 2, I think you have a much better shot of getting something to the legislator. I get a little nervous because if there's somebody on there saying, well, the locals should take care of that, the state shouldn't be funding it. It'll really, I just think it creates 2 distinct buckets where they could just cut one out that's important. And so I would just roll it into planning and make your definition of planning include kind of a phase 1 or 2 or something. I just worry about the terms we're using will create an avenue for people to cut this funding when we take a proposal together. I think it's all important work, but I just put that out for the group.
Anton.
Yeah, I think in reading what pre-planning entailed in this document, I was a little uncertain as to why we were breaking some of those things out and how they were distinguished from just the planning step. I know in the place-based planning, and I think maybe this is where at least some of our input about pre-planning came from. In place-based planning, something was very important and was the initial step was outlining a governance agreement, basically the rules of the road, how the different stakeholders were going to engage with one another and do so in a fair way, and dispute resolution. And that, I think we interpreted as kind of pre-planning before we were talking about water. We needed to figure out what the rules were for working together. And I think that was very, very important. I've represented the Umatilla tribes and other groups where we didn't have that clear governance document, and it certainly created problems later on down the road. So, Kimberly mentioned those guidelines as being part of this. I just want to make sure that that is included somewhere, whether or not we call it pre-planning or it's just wrapped into the planning phase.
Kaylin and then Oriana.
Thanks, Robin. I guess I want to echo Nikki's comment of splitting. I'm feeling like because we've split this out, which there's arguments for doing it this way. What I think what we all want, or I'm assuming what we all want, is like a whole enchilada approach where we've got all 5 phases, however we want to call it, considered as planning. Like the whole thing is planning. Even when you're like in the kind of adaptive management phase, you're still planning. I guess I would just look back like 30 years ago, we had a planning division at Water Resources Department. We had coordinated budget development across state agencies. There is a path for us to get back there. I'll just echo folks who have shared their appreciation for Lily's work to put this together. I do think having participated in multiple of the place-based planning pilots, this pre-planning phase does need a lot of TLC. And I think getting more certainty up front before you're trying to launch into the actual planning is going to be a huge win. And I'll just put in that I think the more that we can formalize state involvement, state support, state agency capacity, we're going to set up the regions for success in the subsequent phases. Thanks.
Thank you, Oriana.
I'm going to pile on here with the kind of concern about some of the structure here. I think we're simultaneously really, really broad and also really, really granular in terms of how we're working through this. And I think we're also kind of reinventing the wheel in some ways. We're drawing a little bit from the past processes, but not necessarily the actual steps that were taken as part of the different planning processes that we've heard about in the past. And I understand that this document pulls from those conversations and the conversations we've had as a group. And I think it's trying very hard to do that. But I think it also feels like it's too specific in some places and too broad in others. And feels a little bit like it's really focused on the what and not necessarily on the why itself. And I think that gets to some of the concerns folks were raising about where the assumptions are coming from. And it's not necessarily, at least in my eyes, looking at kind of where a community is leading in this work, but also where the state is creating its goals and values in the process and trying to meet in the middle. Or maybe it is doing that, but it's not necessarily doing it completely successfully. So I think thinking about it as like pre-planning and planning and then like implementing a plan feel like useful conceptual tools in some ways. But I think to Nikki's point, that is all planning in some ways. And it's more a kind of like what are the questions you have to ask going into the process? And I think to Anton's point about like governance, like what are kind of the conditions that you need in terms of the relationships and the information in order to move forward. But that still feels like that's the first step of planning rather than like preconditions that are necessary to move forward. So I wonder if there's a way to restructure this and focus it a little bit more through the lens of why and what are the lines of inquiry at each stage in the process, as opposed to what are like the really procedural steps that are being taken, because it may look different in different communities depending on what the goals of a community is and how they comport with some of the goals of the state. And I think it probably won't be quite as one size fits all as this document suggests. So I realize that wasn't like the most coherent line through. I'm kind of processing through all of this, but I think like the more we can kind of ask why throughout this, I think the more we can kind of get at something that may really help inform future conversations. Because when it is so procedural, to Nikki's point, it makes it easy to say, well, we don't want to do that part, so we're going to cut it off, as opposed to really looking holistically at the framework.
Okay. So I'm definitely hearing, and I think that from my conversations with WRD, I think a shared recognition that ultimately you have to look at this on the whole, and what the intention for kind of determining with this group, the primary question that they're trying to get at and ask is maybe close to what Kaylin said, which is what should be the state's investment and responsibility of support to planning integrated water resource planning endeavors with regions. I also wonder if the question you're asking, Oriana, about the why and that relationship is part of that is getting worked through in the community and public engagement task group, because of a lot of the questions that you're raising, it feels like that group is talking to as well. So there's kind of two pieces that we're unpacking, which is what should the state's investment and role and responsibility be? That's one. And then another is sort of like how do why and how do people kind of move through this system in a coherent way that yields transparency, equity, and those sorts of things. So I'm going to put a kind of ping on both of those comments, and we'll see if we can look at some of the scenarios and see if there are kind of pieces that you all feel strongly should move forward and where some of those need more definition or don't need prescription. But that should be prevalent no matter who is coming through this process, that they have access to. So Daniel, and then we'll check in on time. We have a break in about 15 minutes.
Great, thank you. This question about what should the state's investment be in the process, when I was looking at that chart about the different levels, one thing that jumped out at me was that depending on how we define the different geographies for the place-based planning, there's going to be a huge level of capacity difference. And I'm wondering if this may be too much in the weeds, but are we thinking in this group we might want to recommend, is this going to be a needs-based grant program? Is it just going to be the same amount of money for each different group? Because certainly, population size, geography size is going to make a huge difference. And, some groups, if they get the grant, they already had some capacity. This is going to allow them to do a really Cadillac version. And then there are going to be other, maybe small rural areas that don't have much of a government to support them and back them up in the local government. The amount of the grant, if it's the same across the board, may not get them to that point where they have the capacity to do this work. So I'm just wondering, when we're talking about this, we might want to talk about kind of the fairness about how the grants are distributed, whether it's need-based, whether it's the same amount for everyone, that type of thing. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Peggy?
So following up with some other conversations. So I appreciated Oriana's comment about there's not been enough conversation about the why. And so I think that's what we're really trying to talk about and what we have talked about at the in-person meeting and whatever, when we talked about pre-planning. We were really saying, so this is what we think the problem is, or these are the problems that we think need to be addressed in our region. So we want to know, so we hope the pre-planning group could say, so what's needed in order to move that forward? Anton brought up the idea that you first need to have some sort of governance structure before you can talk about solving the problem. People might be able to provide a list of the various data that would be needed in order to talk about the issue. So I'm just trying to address the idea of, well, we do need a facilitator, for instance. So those are some of the elements of what we have talked about as far as pre-planning, and whether we roll that up into phase 1 and phase 2 of planning before we actually start talking about solving the problem is fine with me. But I think that that's what we're really trying to get at with the pre-planning.
Okay. So others who have not had a chance to ask a question or offer a comment, I would encourage you to come forward. Dan.
Following up on Daniel's comment there a little bit too, the question, I suppose, I don't know when we address, or do we want just one proposal, or would we consider competing local planning groups proposals at this and I don't care whether we call it pre-planning, planning phase 1, doesn't matter to me. But yeah, I don't know if we want to address that question too, which is sort of that entry level question of how do you get into it. But again, are we looking at just one per basin, per watershed, or having competing groups and potentially multiple grants? Is just addressing that question.
I wonder too if we could hear from some of the other folks who were engaged in place-based planning efforts. I think the evaluation was, one of the evaluation results from that pilot program was the need for step 0. And I think some of this is what you all have been talking about. And out of that, there was a recognition that there really is no structure for this. So the questions that you're raising are important and not answered. There isn't actually a structure for those things right now. And so what advice do you want to give back to the state around what kind of investment and structure should be established to help people prepare for and determine whether or not that what we've learned over time is a pretty deep investment of time and resources by planning groups, by the state, to engage in a deeper integrated water planning effort in the regions. And so that's really the question. I just wonder if there are others from the place-based experience that want to speak to that, sort of what the needs are around a pre-planning and how you and your experience might fashion that, how you would say that we could have been set up even better. We could have been set up even more successfully if we had this, and what that actually looked like. What would that look like?
Well, this is Donna with the Upper Grand Ronde. And I would say, obviously, with us being the first pilot project, we didn't have the guidelines, but in the future, having clear guidelines for all of the steps, I think would be very helpful, because some groups kind of jump around. They don't go like step 1, step 2, you know, like they're kind of doing maybe a couple of different steps at the same time. So if they have those guidelines ahead of time, I think that's one thing and that would be that pre-planning, that step 0 that you guys talked about. But you know, other parts of it are hard for me to say because of each group being so different. I feel that each one of us might have different suggestions on how it could work. But and then at the end, I believe when it's time for your final that you present in the review, which was changed after our group, was where the review team gave suggestions ahead of time instead of you know, shocking the group that they were against everything that they did. So I think that's already been changed, where the review people will say, hey, you know, these are some of the concerns or some of the ideas we have. But I think making sure that that review and that approval all fit with those original guidelines, that's really important.
And then just to follow on, Donna, can you speak more, just even from your own experience of where what's the state role in all of that, the guidelines, the approval, all of that? Did your group have some kind of reflection on what support might be helpful from the state on that?
Well, the state was at they were at every one of our meetings. We had Steve as our representative from OWRD. But like I said, because we were the pilot, but I do think that having that state representative there to remind us, maybe if we go off kilter of what the guidelines are, or maybe even have a conversation of what about this guideline? Could we change that a little bit? Because that doesn't seem to be working. You know, just to be able to have that back and forth, because I'm very appreciative that the state was willing to listen and put the local people at the table. So, I mean, this is such a step forward that I don't want to really go too negative on it. I feel like that we learned a lot and, you know, we did get a lot done. So I was very tickled with what happened, but I do think we learned as we went. Anton could probably talk about it a little bit too, but I think we learned as we went, and a lot of lessons learned, which we shared those lessons learned, you know, when we did our presentation. So
yeah. And if you all see the chat, Holly Mondo, struggling with the internet, but comments would be, it would have been helpful to have a process for identifying and filling data gaps. Spent years trying to plan while also having these huge data gaps that took a very long time to address.
Yeah, which one of our lessons learned and suggestions are that a lot of that data that is already there between the state different agencies, that maybe there's one place where we can find all that data instead of having to hop back and forth between agencies, you know, where they all input and then they don't even have to call each other. They can go to this one place and see, you know, the existing data, and then it also helps us to see where we need more data. But it's easy to find and easy to access for anybody.
Okay, Marianne, Anton, and Peggy. Oh, Peggy's doing a thumbs up on that. Marianne?
Yeah, Robin, I'm not sure this is a well-placed comment here, so I'll say it very briefly. On the kind of pre-planning phase scenarios, to me, I feel like the data gaps that people identified and needing to address the data gaps live in one category of pre-planning work that I think is super important and is something that the state should prioritize. And a lot of what was kind of in the activities completed in pre-planning in table 1 feel like a very hard thing for the state to fund for me, in terms of, and I think others raised it too, you know, what if you have 3 different applicants saying, I want to do pre-planning in the basin, like how is the state going to choose between them, et cetera. It feels like something where the community maybe puts in a little bit of, you know, work up front, whoever wants to convene it, and then we build in some of those activities into like planning, but once they've really shown that they're serious about it, kind of, as opposed to giving the money to see if they want to become serious about it. But I just want to flag, like, I have that comment, but it lives separately in my mind from the data needs, which I think are critical and are important to fund. And I don't think I see them on table 1, unless I'm kind of, I know we have technical support, but to me that, I don't know that was the data collection that Donna and Holly and others were talking about. So.
So follow on for that, to your comment, Marianne, if you're looking across these different scenarios, with the recognition in your mind that it would be difficult to fund, there is a particular important role for the state in helping to fill data gaps and having a process for that. Do you see in these 3 scenarios kind of a sweet spot of kind of what the state could invest in or should invest in this kind of getting folks sort of prepared for and assessing their readiness around going into a deeper, longer term planning investment?
I say this, but with reserving the right to change it later as I understand more about it. Maybe that situational assessment only where they're doing the metrics to evaluate the success of pre-planning and review of pre-planning to determine viability. That feels, but that also feels like that's kind of going to be inherent in like when they apply for a grant for actual planning, like the state will do those things in reviewing the grant, I would think, of like, are they really ready for planning? So I don't know. I struggle a little bit with this because, you know, I feel like we've talked a lot about the public good coming from planning, and to me, the pre-planning feels like the state could throw a lot of money away that doesn't end up resulting in, you know, somebody coming forward with a proposal to engage in some sort of place-based planning activity. But I'm like, I'm open to being like, this is something I'm very open to being talked into. I just, right now, I feel like it creates more struggles than answers for me.
Okay. Thank you. Anton.
Just reflecting on maybe some of the steps that the state could take proactively that might fall into some sort of, you know, pre-planning approach. We leaned on the state agencies very heavily for the data required to kind of create our water budget, try to quantify water supply, water demand. And if there's any way that the state can kind of figure out what that framework looks like and just be ready to deploy that in a particular basin. And maybe the state already is doing this, but that might be sort of a pre-planning step that would be helpful. Just have the agencies ready to go. They know what data sources they need to look at when a basin is thinking about planning, and they would have those things at their fingertips. That might be helpful. I felt like we were kind of learning as we went in the pilot in the Upper Grand Ronde, but maybe there's something that we could have kind of canned with the agency so they're ready to deploy that when planning starts.
All right, so I know that there are, Jennifer, sorry, DEQ, Jennifer, I know you're going to be presenting some information and talking about a pretty big data management project that you and other water state agencies are working on. There's some overlap, obviously, with this conversation. Do you want to say anything about, just kind of based on what you've heard so far, about teeing that up or how that might intersect with the conversation we're going to have in September?
Yeah, I'll take a little stab at it now, Robin. I guess maybe just to start with kind of definitional what we're working on. So out of the last session, DEQ was charged with leading an interagency effort to scope out and provide recommendations around a water portal. So just to be clear, what I mean when I say water portal, it's not a common database. it would be kind of a window through which data could be accessed and then served up in some degree of organizing, or maybe even kind of, maybe it could do some simple graphs or something like that. So kind of a window and kind of an interface in which the ideal being certain kinds of questions could be answered that people have about water related data. So the effort that we have underway is really to look at how we might be able to structure that, recognizing that the states, at a minimum, the state's data, and there's also some questions out there related to scope about whose all data we're talking about. But I'll just start with the state data, since I can maybe speak a little bit better to that than other owners of other data sets. But there's a wide variety in terms of the current condition of that data. We know, and it's been exemplified here in this conversation, there's also a lot of gaps in terms of what the data that the state has and what it doesn't have that can be brought to any particular conversation where we're trying to make decisions, do planning, management activities. And so we expect that through this process, we'll be saying, well, here's what we have, here's the condition of all that. Here are some really important data sets that are desirable for common and important types of decisions that are needed. And here are some recommendations, so everything from technology platforms to level of effort that's going to be required, both to make existing data sets available and also critical data sets that may not exist. So that's the effort that we're undergoing under a time frame that really has us providing recommendations to the legislature that'll be convening in 2023. So like Robin said, we've been talking about how to bring some of, given the interest here around both having access to existing data, but also understanding that there's data gaps, that this would be a good group to talk about this. We're also going to be in the process of planning and figuring out how to set up a couple other forums with stakeholders to get some feedback to help us do those planning and recommendations. So we thought this would be both given the interest here and the work that we need to do on the data portal. There's a good marriage to be made about having an agenda item on this topic in September.
Great, thanks. So a lot more to come, and I think there's some framing questions that are coming through this discussion today that we'll talk with you about and see if there's a way to sort of figure out if those questions do get addressed in your process, and if not, what this group can do to kind of provide feedback, advice, recommendations to the state about setting up that process for filling data gaps, which has emerged as a primary need in, at least from the place-based and past regional planning efforts. So with that, I'm going to call a break. We're running just 5 minutes past our break time, so let's plan to come back at 1:20. That gives us a full half hour, and we will resume the conversation. We are going to go into just a quick poll to see if there is some alignment on some of the pieces of the pre-planning, and then we'll turn it back to WRD to go into the planning to action part that they've developed. So we'll see you back here in 30 minutes. So I just want to, oh, thank you, Jenna. So we're recording now. The Community and Public Engagement Task Committee, who signed up to help develop a guide and kind of think through a little bit more around principles and best practices for that piece, has been established and have been working together. I will just note who's on the group, and then I'll turn it over to one of the members to share a quick status update. So the members of that group are Adam, Anna, April, Kristen, Marianne, Oriana, and Peggy. Lily's been involved as a technical staff person, and my team has been involved to help facilitate the conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Peggy to give a quick status update.
Thank you. I attended the second of the two meetings that this work group has had already, and we are expected to have a third one. So we still have a draft of a draft of a draft, which provides you with the opportunity to give us more input. So what we're doing is to create a purpose of informed and engaged communities and the public. Why is this important? So we created a set of tentative principles. And before I get into them really quickly, we know that at least 2 of those items need yet to be resolved, and we're working on them. The balance between the public ownership for this process with of water with the private use of the water through regulations. So how do we do, and then how do we do community-led with statewide interests and make sure that both of those are addressed? The work group members are still to provide some additional information from the Racial Justice Council's Environmental Equity Committee and from Water Futures as we continue to work on this plan. So we have some tentative principles for regional water planning public engagement. The regional planning should be collaborative and community-led, and that's one of them that we're working on. Participation in regional planning should be balanced and inclusive. Regional planning should be transparent and accessible for all. Tribal sovereignty should be honored in regional planning. Regional planning should foster public input early in the process and ongoing. Regional planning should sustain an informed public. Regional planning should be a collaborative endeavor that supports trust building between all participants, community members, and the state. As for state responsibilities to support and ensure regional planning meets informed and engaged community principles, we are saying that there certainly needs to be data and that there needs to be metrics for success and ways to be accountable. We hope to also provide perhaps a toolbox based on the lessons learned from the original place-based planning groups and other regional planning efforts in Oregon. Underneath each of those principles is a set of subtitles for which I will not get into, but you are welcome to join us if you'd like to help us make this happen. And I think I did what I was asked to do. And Jenna is supposed to perhaps tell us when our next subgroup meeting is.
I would be happy to weigh in. Right now, it looks like from the responses that have been received from the task group members, that August 15th is the best date of alignment, and we need to do one last round of scheduling to see what that best time is. So August 15th, more information coming soon.
Thank you. And if you are interested in joining and participating in that work, it's not too late. Just let myself or Lily or Jenna know, and we'll make sure to bring you into the fold. Any of the other task group members want to share any more about what you're working on? All right, much more to come from that group in September. And as Peggy suggested, there's an interest of that group on that topic to try to engage some external experts and perspectives just to help do some review and do some good thinking, kind of, thought partnering with that smaller group. So they'll have something to share with you in draft form in September, and we'll get everybody's fingerprints on it. So thanks to that group for making the extra time to contribute to that piece. And that's a good sort of segue to, I just want to, before we tee up this next little bit, we really are hoping that others from the work group will volunteer to help develop some of these ideas further. So what we're about to do is engage you in a little bit of just a quick alignment poll, if you will. It's going to be anonymous. It's not a decision point, really. It's just a way for us to determine, what items might move forward and what items need more work, that should move forward and need more work. And so you've raised a lot of questions today that kind of speak to some of the question marks and even some of the, I think, perspective and opinion about like, where is the sweet spot on this pre-planning phase? And again, I just want to reemphasize, we heard pretty clearly from several members that, you know, seeing this in a comprehensive way is going to be important. So while we are sort of parsing out this piece of it, and this is a structural piece that doesn't exist right now in the Oregon system, while we're carving that out, it doesn't mean that you won't ultimately look at the full arc of the system and see, does it actually make sense the way we're fitting these pieces together? So we're asking you to kind of do some pockets of the work now, but ultimately we'll be wanting to bring this together to see where we might kind of build a more comprehensive frame around this kind of state supportive regional planning piece. So with that caveat and with the sincere invitation and hope that people will sign up to assist WRD in a next step on some of these pieces, we're going to initiate a quick poll to just see what sort of is floating toward the top in terms of, or not the top, but what's floating toward the, you know, there's general alignment that this is a piece that should move forward for consideration. So Jenna is going to give you a link. She just put it into the chat. And what it does, and actually, Jenna, if you don't mind, if we could show the scenarios table. I actually can share my screen real quickly. Oops, you're so good. Never mind. This is really what this poll is organized around. So the way WRD laid this out is there's kind of like the scenarios themselves are sort of like variations on how deep the investment and support and role of the state is in this kind of planning readiness aspect. And then it's broken down into different activities. And we heard that maybe some of these activities might be considered not just activities completed by a local planning group or the state. And so some of that nuance will definitely need to be sort of further deliberated on. But we want to start with just seeing if there's the scaffolding of a work group scenario that will help us compel some of the details forward. And so if everyone agrees that, you know, we don't think a certain aspect is important for this system and we don't need to spend more time working on it, we'll take it off the table. But mostly what we're looking for is, yeah, this is an important piece of structurally for the system. And for some of these items, it deserves more detail or refinement that should happen through this work group process in the time that you have. And so that's our early gauge of just a quick gauge, and we'll see what pops out of that. And then we'll see where there's energy from work group members to take some of these pieces and evolve them further. And it still is not a proposal. It's still not a decision point, but it is a kind of evolving body of work that we're hoping to have people bring back maybe in August, but for sure by September. Kimberly?
Yeah, so is it correct to say that you're polling us on the activities, but not necessarily about who is doing the activities? So for instance, I might be in favor of a situational assessment if it was the state doing it as opposed to that kind of, okay.
Yes, yes. And you'll see there's kind of a yes, and then there's a qualified yes. And the qualified yes would say yes, and it needs more refinement or detail. And so that might be an area where you would qualify it, something like that. Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you for that. That's a really good clarifying question. And then the other thing I just want to note is there may be activities that WRD didn't capture that people feel really strongly are important structural elements that did not get captured. And that will be something that we can also flag as potentially more body of work, especially if people have the interest and motivation to work on them, then let's bring it into the fold. And that'll play into our later conversation about how do individuals bring ideas forward. But let's hold that process thought for a moment. So we're just going to initiate the poll and see what we come up with. So if you can just go into the chat, click on the link that Jenna just put, and we'll give you a couple minutes. You can take a little bit of time, but I would say think about sort of what you've heard in the conversation today and really what you think is on the whole really important kind of structural pieces that require some version of state support to be built into the system. I'm just seeing your question, Kate. Sorry. First few leave room for comments if you choose the middle one until you get to state agency activities. Was this purposeful? No, it was not. Let's see if we can get, is it easy enough to update that, Jenna? Okay, let's just try to update it real quick while people, and if you want to go back in, I think you can go back in if you want to leave some more comment, Kate. One member is asking if they have to leave and want to fill this out later. So I think we can offer this opportunity to all the work group members. So the caveat, I guess, will just be the results might shift some, although it's really important for us to figure out bodies of work moving forward today. So we are going to rely on the results of this and the conversation that you've had today to move things forward. But still open the possibility up for work group members who weren't here to fill it out, and we'll share that with you at a later time. All right. Take another minute or so. Give it a few more minutes. I think there are about 5 or 6 still coming in. Marianne's ready to move on. Does anybody need more time? Telling us that won't reveal what your responses are. Does anyone need more time from the work group? Just flag us if you do. Okay. I'm going to double check. Are Nikki, Bobby, and or April back with us? I just want to double check that you're with us.
Yeah, I'm on. I've already completed the survey.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did mine.
Okay, not to call you out. I just had
Same here. I've been here
earlier. Okay.
since before the survey and I filled it out.
Okay.
Yep. Just didn't want to
Okay.
interrupt the discussion.
Appreciate you. Thank you. All right. Well, I think without further ado, let's just see what we came up with, what y'all came up with. So Jenna's going to show that, and then, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Sorry, just 1 second.
Jenna, are you able to show the pie chart?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Responses? Let's just show that too, just so it's real transparent. Okay. So what we're going to do with this is take kind of, if there's a clear signal, a strong enough signal, we'll move it over to the work group potential scenario. And those that are caveated will say those are ones that kind of need more time, more detail, more refinement. So there's a pretty clear yes that convening and facilitating is important. And for a lot of you, this needs more detail or refinement. And so it might signal that we need to work on this piece a little bit more. But we'll definitely move it into the column of the work group potential scenario. The community engagement one, very clearly, this should move forward. We didn't ask about detail because there's a task group working on this. So let's let them do their work, and then we'll come back. And if there's more that's needed to be done after September, we'll know at that time. Situational assessment is yes. And
hey, Robin, can I stop you there? I think I'm maybe, oh, and I'll turn my video on. I think I was maybe just perpetually confused. I'm on the community engagement task force. I thought we were working on community engagement as it relates to the planning processes, not pre-planning.
That's a good point, Mary.
I was the no answer.
Okay.
And it's not because I don't think community engagement's important, but because I'm still struggling with the pre-planning grants idea and like state funding pre-planning and state supported pre-planning. So that's what I brought into these assumptions. And hey, there was only one no.
There were a couple no's, sounds like.
So I just want to make sure we were all answering the same question, because your response just really threw me for a loop.
Okay, so you were saying no, that it shouldn't be a state resourced element of pre-planning, but not to say that it's not important. Is that what you're trying to clarify?
Right. And when you said there's a work group working on this, I was like, I'm on that work group, and I thought we were talking about community engagement as it relates to place-based planning, not community engagement as it relates to pre-planning.
Okay.
Yeah, Robin, I had the same differentiation.
Okay, thank you. So let's hold that and see if, if there's energy for people to kind of invest more time and energy in like what should or should not be resourced by the state in terms of the pre-planning part of community engagement. We'll do that. But for now, let's just assume that it's important for most people on this group, that it is an important aspect of pre-planning. And I'll also flag that, Marianne, for us to revisit with, oh, go ahead, April. Also confused. Should think a question should be asked on the pre-planning phase as a whole. We will ask that eventually, but we are trying to figure out what the makings, the scaffolding looks like. So on the whole, we're going to look at that picture in a moment. Marianne, April. So hold that thought for just a moment, if you wouldn't mind. Peggy thought it was about all the work. So I am going to put a pin in that and bring it back to the task group to talk about a little bit. And we'll come back with some thinking around that.
Hey, Robin, can we, I assume you're taking all of this. I'm not convinced we were all answering the same questions. Can we, yeah, I don't know. Can we, I just want to flag, I guess, that I don't know that we were all on the same page. And so I wonder about the utility of the survey.
I'm going to respectfully ask we just pull it up, and then if people are seeing something that looks way off, let's talk about it. So one might be the community engagement. If you don't mind, I'm just going to go through this a little bit further, Marianne. So the question that we asked is, in the pre-planning phase, is this an important piece that should be structured into the system in pre-planning? And the follow-on question will be, to what degree and how should the state invest and have a role in it? So a lot of people are saying, I asked, this was on the whole, not just pre-planning. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I probably got a little bit more annoyed with that part, because I think that it's a weakness if there isn't community engagement in the first place. And I have a comment in this that you should either have to rationalize that or explain why when their application for the whole thing moves forward. I just saw layering on process in a pre-planning will just further make the planning exercise seem more daunting. And so that's the reason that I think it's as an evaluative tool. When you're comparing projects, those who do the work on the ground should be rewarded.
So can I ask, because a lot of you are saying that this kind of differentiating between pre and planning, that for many of you, it's all sort of wrapped into the same, but there are aspects of kind of readiness that really hadn't been structured in at least the place-based pilots, and that seemed important. So if we were to reframe this as this is kind of a readiness piece of planning, because these are all pieces that you would do, presumably you would do up front. That was kind of the, I think, assumption that WRD was taking when they put these different activities into this, into these scenarios. And I'll verify that with Tom and Lily first. Just one sec, Jeff. I do see your hand.
I think that's accurate, Robin.
So the assumption was it's around sort of the early step 0 is what it was called in place-based, in the evaluation of place-based, but it's sort of those early steps that kind of create the conditions and or the understanding of a group's readiness. And those, if you really look at it, it's sort of looking at, is the community ready to engage in a kind of integrated collaborative effort? And also, is the information needed to help you do planning? So the big piece around data that you all have been talking about is another aspect of that. And so it's sort of trying to figure out, where should we structure, how should that be structured, and how much investment should the state make in that piece of it? So I'm just wondering if we were to reframe this and say that this is kind of an early part of planning, so we don't get too wrapped around distinguishing between those two, because I do hear clearly that making that distinction is not really working for people. Would that be, can I just get a thumbs up on whether that would be okay for just to do a quick reframing of that? And to really consider that this really is part of planning. It's just those really early steps that get you to understand and be ready to go into that deeper planning effort. So I just want first to see if I can get an okay on that, just to frame it in that way. And if anybody has real concerns with us framing it in that way, please speak up. Okay, so I've got Peggy, April, and Kaylin.
So really quickly to follow up on that. So part of the problem that I had with, you have convening and facilitating, in one place. And like many of the people, I think the very first part of deciding whether you were going to convene or not is a local decision with some local skin in the game. But once you need a facilitator to begin having to put together the group, do the governance structure, consider the data gaps and whatever, then you're going to need some professionals facilitating that will take some state funding. So again, that's part of, I think, what I'm trying to grapple with is that portion of it.
Okay, thank you. At what point would you resource that and provide that support? Okay, thank you. April?
Thanks. So I think, when I responded to the survey based on what I saw, which was specific to the pre-planning components, envisioning that we were going to have a similar survey on the other two things. Just ensuring a few thoughts on this, because I think it is, depending on your perspective and experience with planning, these words all mean very different things. And so I think in going up to a higher altitude view, I look at what we're trying to create as a toolbox of things that communities can use to plan for their shared water needs or places, however we want to phrase that. I think where we get into further confusion, but it's important that we sort it out as a work group, particularly as we start having work products that come out, is what is the state's role in helping places with their planning? And then going a step further, what sort of assistance is the state providing? And then where we really get into the meatiness is what requirements does the state have that goes along with that assistance? And I think that's where, I know you guys are trying your best, but that survey was massively flawed in that we all, I think, just answered it in very different ways. But those are areas that we need to discuss further. And I think for me, this notion of pre-planning or step zero, or however you want to characterize it, some of that is coming from folks that have had experience and have seen what's been missing as they go through the current state structured process. But what I look at it when I'm seeing and being realistic is we've already spent an enormous amount of time as a group to getting where we are today. And we have a lot of work to do if we're going to come up with anything that's going to be viable for something, creating a program or adding to an existing program. I don't mean to pop balloons, but I'm being realistic in that. And so to me, where I think we should be spending our most energy is on creating what you have as the table 2, the planning program and the way that the state can best support that. The pre-planning stuff can be helpful, and I think there's a lot in there that relates to the meat of the middle. But if we spend all this time talking about what pre-planning is or isn't, we're not going to have the time that we need to be spending on the actual planning program, let alone if we're going to get into the post-plan, moving the plan to action. I look at a lot of the stuff that's on the pre-planning list as being in 2 buckets. One, you have what the place, the community, the basin would be doing, which I think any entity could do those things without state support. And then you have what the state can do to help. As we've talked about ad nauseum, both here and elsewhere, the state has a huge lack of data that would be helpful in this and other places. We're not trying to solve all that. And I think, data, community engagement, outreach, those are all important things. And just because one of us says that we're not a fan of that being part of this particular widget doesn't mean we're not supportive of that. But I think we need to be realistic and focusing on what can the state do to be helpful in planning. This pre-planning stuff to me mostly is, if you were to look at it from a non-regulatory standpoint, it would be and someone mentioned it earlier, it's like a pre-application meeting or an interview. And what resources does the state have? There could be websites and different things you go to. Like, I've already spent more time talking than I would like to about this issue. And so I'm just saying, I would really like us to be focusing on the planning part and be very specific when we're asking for input. Like, for example, how many of us think that we should be spending more time on this pre-planning part versus getting into the planning part? I'm not asking that as an actual question, but at some point really soon, we do actually need to ask where there's support for things so that we're not spending time and energy on something that's not going to be broadly supported. Thank you.
Thanks, April. And yeah, we were basing this actually on feedback that we got about what is important, and that this being a missing structural piece is why it came forward as such. But I hear you. And I also have to say, we did hear pretty clearly from others preceding today that this was a really important missing piece that's not structured into the system. And so we're trying to understand from this group if there's some structural pieces, and if they need definition, what that should look like. And this seemed like the group to do that. So I guess that's the logic thought behind this, April. And I hear you loud and clear that for you, getting to the other pieces is going to be really important. So Kaylin, Jeff, and then Oriana.
Thanks. I guess initially I think I want to caution against what is the word? Making step 0 and pre-planning equivalent. And the reason for that would be that in the current place-based planning pilot framework, step 0 would have occurred for groups that had already initiated planning, and they had already kind of self-selected and applied for this. And what I was hearing from that assessment, and what I told the assessors, was having that baseline data, the baseline situational assessment, kind of tells you how much support that group that has already been kind of decided to go down the planning process together needs. It's not, what I'm seeing in this proposal here is like it's a gatekeeping function on whether planning will actually move forward in a place. So I mean, I think it would be amazing if there was basically every basin across the state was able to have this pre-planning done. Like, hey, here's our best guess at your water budget, right? Let's then use that to initiate our kind of our situational assessment. Right now, the way that we're kind of looking at this is that there wouldn't even be an opportunity to get to step 0 until a lot of work had already been done. And that's where I'm struggling with, like, step 0 was already for, you know, it would be like the Mid-Coast would, you know, they'd get their grant to do place-based planning, and then step 0 would be kind of all of that work that had already been done by the state to deliver to them, to like, here's your baseline data and your baseline analysis and our baseline guess. Now group is where you jump off from. So those are just some reflections.
Okay, thank you. Jeff?
So I think about those rascals over there in Byler County who really want to do something. And I think it's incumbent upon, no matter what this looks like, that there's some place where they can look at what would make a successful plan and what that looks like, and not quite checklisty, but to see, be able to assess, you know, where, you know, how it can be viewed when it's competing against other plans for funding, that they have a reasonable chance. I look at it for the topic that we have at hand. They should have tools, much like April said, that could be utilized, especially for those who would look at this and have no idea or very low confidence in their abilities to ascertain what community engagement is. And it doesn't say what type, it's not prescriptive, but it gives, I mean, I think that's where we need to focus to try to be guideposts, buoys, if you will, so they have the ability to have a chance to successfully apply. And again, step 0, pre-planning, planning, post-planning. Let's make 18 of them and just make it completely unworkable. I mean, that's the way it's feeling for me when I think this is important work. And Barter's right. I mean, I would love to have everybody ready to go in 36 counties. But I would settle for 3. But that's just my point.
Okay, thanks. Oriana?
Yeah, I think what I'm struggling with a little bit here, and maybe what's made the survey confusing for folks, is the structure of the kind of concrete procedural steps of pre-planning, planning, and like putting a plan to action. But the reality that many of the actions kind of listed, or the elements of the survey, are things that I think, going back to Donna's comment about how they took the steps that were part of the place-based planning process, but they didn't necessarily do them in a linear fashion. I think we're thinking about something very linearly that is not linear in nature. And I think Jeff's getting at that a little bit with community engagement, and maybe the dissent on that question was less about like, oh, it's not valuable, but that like, where does it happen? And if it happens at the start, but it doesn't happen all the way through, you erode trust. So there are some elements that need to go across all of the phases, and some elements that are a little more discrete. Like you need that data going in, sort of to Kaylin's point. Like you need to have a certain set of information, and you also need to understand on the back end, like what are the criteria for a plan. So I feel like some of the confusion is like we're thinking about that in these like really concrete silos of steps, when it's really kind of a little bit more crisscrossy. And it's the actions themselves that are what are like the kind of continuous pieces that we should be identifying, like when does it happen and who is involved and why does it happen?
Just reading Kate's comment in the chat. States should not gatekeep the ability to undertake planning, should provide data and framework to groups who are interested. Another question may be whether states want to actively nurture basins forming groups, whether they don't exist, and to provide resources for that, whether they wait for groups to coordinate and approach them. So Daniel, and then I'll make a quick ask for next steps on this so we can hear from WRD on the other piece that they've developed.
Yeah, the more I listen to these comments, the more I'm convinced that we're not really agreeing on the terms and what things mean. You know, this term pre-planning. I mean, I'm hearing, like, from what Kaylin said about the process she was involved in the past and the different kind of planning. And then I'm also hearing somewhat of pre-planning, maybe it's more of an eligibility test or something like that. And the information you bring together so that, you know, the state can decide whether or not, you know, they think you have the capacity to move forward, whether or not you have the commitment. And so I think it would be really helpful to kind of define what we mean. That way we could all kind of decide. But just as a general pitch, it seems like in this state, and maybe it's true in every state, that there's just so much planning that goes on and so much resources in planning that I would just say whatever we can do to make this process simpler and not have as much planning, you know, whatever we can do to make it more efficient would be great. And I do think that stakeholder engagement is a really critical part of this. I just wonder, though, at the very earliest stages, before you even determine that you can move forward, you sort of need to have that local government buy-in. And if you don't have that, I'm not sure it makes sense to spend money on stakeholder engagement if you don't even know you're going to be able to move forward with the process. They're just my thoughts.
Right. So as you, Daniel, and others see what the makings of like a situational assessment might be as one of the pieces of this puzzle that sort of doesn't formally exist, as I understand it, in the system, but is probably done in different ad hoc fashion. But this would be a question of, should this be built in and an opportunity for people to come together to do that? You see the elements of that are both around data and around community readiness and interest, really. So I just want to ask a question, because I think I'm getting mixed messages from across the group, which is not surprising, about how important this is and even how important it is for this group to focus on it, and if it's not important to focus on. So I'm just going to ask if there are individuals on this work group who feel compelled to try to build some of these ideas out for this, what we might not call pre-planning, we might not call step 0, but it's really that early step of determining readiness and maybe even preparing. So being ready and or ascertaining readiness. And if those folks that feel this is important, that it should be structured into the system, will you speak now, and let's get a little group going to take this offline and work with WRD to build something out. And there are several questions that are being asked within this. Part of it is this a toolbox piece? Is it a requirement? What's the state's role in assisting this? And kind of sorting through that and maybe coming back with maybe a little bit of a proposal or an idea for the group to consider. Sorry, my people are getting snacks. So sorry, I'm not speaking off mute. But if we do nothing with this, then we kind of sit with status quo, and status quo is there really isn't anything structured into the system right now by way of some of these pieces. Peggy.
So I think that there are elements that we heard from the place-based planning groups and frankly from the other groups that are needed as a part of moving forward with planning, with doing a full planning issue. I'm trying to figure out if there's really criteria or simply a list of things that are needed, and whether or not that's sufficient so as not to make it more complicated to address Daniel's comment. I think we have heard that there are certain things that are needed. There are people need to know why they need to know why they're doing it. They need to define why they're doing it. They need to say what it is they think preliminarily they're going to need in order to do the job. And then they need to move to pre-planning is this big compared to this big of planning, which is we now get a facilitator and we work on governance structure, we work on getting the data, etc. And I'll be happy to hear from Adam. I'll be quiet.
Thank you. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to kind of stay out of the conversation here, I guess, a little bit. Because we're getting kind of hung up on planning and pre-planning. And, I think it's all planning is what it is. But I think what we have is an opportunity here, and I'm not going to, I don't want to put work in Director Byler's lap and his team. He's busy, but I think that we have steps in this process, if you will, or processes that we're struggling with. And from the standpoint of place-based planning, and just speaking from our experience here on the Oregon coast, I wish we would have had more structure from the state on something that would have met some eligibility requirements or pre-qualification requirements, something that would have said, okay, this group can move forward with a application for funding for planning because you've met these pre-qualification requirements. You have you have the buy-in from your community for planning. You have someone who's willing, or a local government, whether it's a district or a city or a county, that's willing to serve as the fiscal agent in that process. You have a governance document, some type of guidance there. These are pre-planning steps, in my opinion, that allow for that successful commitment from a community for place-based planning. And I think that needs to be developed. I'm not suggesting that this now somehow triggers a ad hoc committee to develop those, but it is a similar process that you would go through with a funding agency to meet the requirements for funding, depending on whatever project, whether it's a planning activity or an actual physical project. So I think that when I think of pre-planning, that's what I look at it as pre-planning. And yeah, there were things on the Mid-Coast that we could have done better, that would have made things more successful, and maybe this is one of them. And so I'll leave it at that, and hopefully that doesn't confuse the conversation any more than it seems like it is.
I'm hearing, Adam, that there's kind of a plug to, yes, there needs some structure built into this piece, whatever you call it. It would have been valuable to your experience and maybe others. But also you're not sure you're ready to jump in and sign on to help develop that. And whether or not WRD should pursue this as something to bring back to the group. I think we can ask that question as well. Let me hear from Bobby and Dan, and then I think we do need to move on so Lily can share the second half of her work. She's done a lot to develop this. So Bobby and Dan.
Okay, it's always interesting listening to the group and everyone's thoughts and comments on there, and so it just seems like we're a little bit hung up here on the pre-planning and the planning, but the pre-planning. But sitting here listening, it's it sounds to me that we're hung up with a little bit. Is this mandatory or is this not mandatory? Is this mandatory criteria? Yes or no? I don't. And then listening to the group, I don't think that's necessarily the road that we're going down for the pre-planning. It sounds like a lot of the groups just really want help and support. They want to have data from the state. Hey, state, can you help us out? We need some help here. We're struggling. We don't have all the information. Just give us some guidance here, so we can move forward to move into the more deep planning, as it may be. So that's just my thoughts right now, listening to the group. And I think we're just still kind of struggling. Is this mandatory criteria or not?
Yeah.
Also hearing that a lot of folks just want support. These groups just want support to be able to move forward.
Right. Thank you. Dan.
Yeah, I would kind of be with Bobby on that, but I think we're getting unnecessarily hung up on what we're calling it. Whether you call it all planning, pre-planning, I don't care. But there are obviously earlier stages of planning that happen and later stages. But I think the more important part is to look on what the issues really are. And I think what Bobby was just talking about, and I think Adam earlier stuff was, capacity.
Mm-hmm.
However you define that, whether the participants or capacity to be able to analyze the information. And going in, is there the capacity? And then one thing I think is important at the beginning and maybe needs to be fleshed out more is that question of composition of the group. And this kind of goes back to an observation made earlier about why earlier basin plans did or didn't work. And as I heard the answers historically, the basin plans that worked had a very inclusive, broad group of folks supporting it and involved with it, and they worked. And the ones that didn't, or didn't even happen, because they didn't have that broad-based group composition. And so I think if you're looking at the early stage, and an important part of the early stage is coming up with who should be in this group, who needs to be in this local planning group for it to be deserving of state support. And I think whether you call that pre-planning or just part, well, I don't care what you call it. I think focusing on that element is is going to be a critical part.
Okay. Thank you. So let me just turn back to Tom and Lily before we move on to the next step. There's been a lot of conversation around these different pieces. I'm definitely hearing there's an importance and value. I'm definitely hearing that there's a question mark around sort of trying to put a little more kind of recommendation or idea around whether this is sort of a required step to get to the bigger step, or if it's a tool that's available, you know, for groups to help them get prepared. And what I think we're trying to do is maybe through our scenarios, show the discernment between those. So I'm just wondering if, and again, if anyone feels compelled, like this is something we really should develop, if you're willing to help WRD develop something, we'd love for you to come forward. And then I guess the follow-on to Tom and Lily is, do you feel like you have stuff to go on that it's worth maybe putting some refinement into this, but mixing it in with whatever you share out at our next stop around the planning kind of piece of it. So kind of wrapping this into the planning piece of it.
I'm not sure if work group members wanted to weigh in. We would welcome any work group members who would like to roll up their sleeves with us and put a little bit of flesh on the bones that we've been talking about with respect to this idea. A lot of great thoughts have been put forward. It's not clear to me. I don't have a clear sense of direction from the group in terms of level of state investment. I guess we tried to kind of give folks a kind of full, medium, and light. And I'm hearing a little bit of it all right now, which is fine. I think that's part of the deliberative process. But you know, we would welcome work group members to sit down with us to help develop ideas. But whether or not work group members have the time and desire to do that, we could draft up and kind of flesh out the skeleton a bit around this issue this area based on the conversation that we've been hearing so far, and bring forward some options perhaps that are a little more detailed for folks to consider, if that's of interest to the group.
Okay, Margaret.
So is that an invitation from Director Byler to be able to provide a concept paper that I have developed?
I certainly would welcome anyone who has ideas to bring them forward. What I was specifically asking is for folks to join Lily and I in developing some draft ideas for this group based on the conversation that the group was having today.
And how does one join you and Lily in that effort?
You can start by raising your hand.
Yeah,
today.
let us know if you're interested. Okay, Margaret is interested, so absolutely.
But will this be a consensus conversation, or will it be?
So Margaret, here's how I look at it. I look at it, we're in service of the work group, and we're offering up ideas for the work group to react to and respond to help stimulate the conversation and keep us moving forward.
Thank you. I would love to work with you on that.
Great.
Thank you. All right, let's move to the next piece. And anyone that wants to kind of say, actually, I want to join Margaret and work with WRD on this, I want to do that too, feel free to chime in, chat or otherwise. Kimberly?
Yeah, I just want to be clear. Sorry, I can't. Again, I think Tom stated it well, that at least what I'm hearing the department is doing is taking conversations and fleshing out the skeleton. You know, I think that's a very different thing than having folks try and interweave their proposals into the state's proposal. We are creating a space for that, Margaret. So this is not, in other words, we as a group are trying to develop something together. And so what I heard the department say is that they are going to flesh this out based on group conversations and previous work. So just clarifying.
And I heard Director Byler invite us to give him input. So I guess maybe my ears are hearing things differently. I don't
think you are hearing it right.
If you do not want me to provide any input with Director Byler, I will not do that. I will wait until the group wants to have me present the concept paper. I just don't want to wait until, you know, I'm 75, which is only a year away. So
yeah, I think it's a both and. So let's just think about how this proceeds, because for all of you, any of you that are kind of developing ideas or have things that you would love for the group to kind of put before the group, let's first see if there's a crosswalking with what the development of the product that WRD is holding the pen on, to see if it can integrate and or crosswalk with some of the ideas that are emerging through that. So joining up with WRD to develop these things out and bring them back for the work group to deliberate on seems absolutely what we're asking for right now. If what you see is we've got a sort of different proposal, kind of a different concept or a different idea or something that's different than what we're discussing, we should make a channel for that too, but we should just make sure we're clear about what those are. And so I think it's both and. So if you have a specific proposal that you want to bring forward on your own, that's okay. And also if you want to work with WRD to help build something that kind of reflects back some of the conversation we've had and is an opportunity for people to sort of look at this the way that they've sort of laid it out, then let's do that. And I really feel like we need to let the department kind of go through their next step. But I do see, Kimberly, that you're willing to work on this too. Go ahead. Yeah, I see your hand. Go ahead.
I mean, honestly, I think we should give the department a chance to work through this and then we can provide feedback. But if they want to convene a work group, then I think a broader stakeholder work group, I think a balance of interest should be involved in that participation in that meeting.
Okay. And Daniel's asking about timing. I think the idea is let's get something going over the next couple of weeks, so we can bring something back to the work group at our next stop. See if that's ready. Happy to help. Kate's happy to help as well. Thank you. All right, let's move on to the second piece. And I'll turn it over to Lily.
Me, okay.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can figure this out again. Okay, just great conversation. It's a lot of great ideas being thrown around. So I'm excited to sort of dive into that pre-planning piece. But with the remaining time we have today, or at least part of the remaining time, we have developed options and scenarios for that third phase. We're skipping over planning and moving into that moving a plan to action phase, or what we've called that. And this phase is really focused on making sure that the plan is implemented and doesn't just sit on a shelf. So the way we've thought about it is that this could include anything up to project implementation. So it might be like further refinement of strategies. It could be addressing policy needs. It could be implementing feasibility studies or any other sort of technical assistance that would be needed prior to preparation for a project. In the same way we did before for the pre-planning phase, we developed 3 scenarios based on a suite of options that we heard from work group conversations. And these include full state support. So scenario number 1, where the legislature would appropriate funding to a state agency, which would include grant funds for implementation coordination, along with funding for state agency capacity to continue to engage in and support this phase. And then scenario 2 would be just funding to support local groups in implementation coordination. And then the third is, again, that sort of ad hoc funding from the legislature to support local planning groups to do convening and facilitating. So diving in a little bit deeper into each of these scenarios, that full state support scenario, just to remind you, this does correspond to table 2 in the draft document that we sent out. So in the first scenario, with full state support, the state would support local groups to engage in implementation coordination through convening and facilitating community engagement, sort of those through lines that we had in the pre-planning phase, and then also to some extent grant writing and administration, and then continued engagement with state agencies and partners. State funding could also support in this scenario that state agencies implementing those or administrating those implementation grants, and then also support an integrated multi-agency team that would continue to provide coordination and consultation with local planning groups, technical support as needed to the local planning groups, and permit coordination might be another benefit of that interagency team. And then finally, the outcomes of this full state support scenario would be continued refinement of project prioritization and an implementation strategy, along with continued collaboration between local planning groups and state agencies. And then scenario 2, sort of that middle of the road scenario again. In this scenario, the state would support implementation coordination by the local planning groups, but there wouldn't be that continued state role in coordination and collaboration. And then finally, that third support again, or that third scenario again, would just be limited state support and would really just be funding from the legislature directly to local planning groups to allow them to continue to meet as a group without some of those other aspects of implementation coordination, like continued community engagement or grant writing and administration. And then because there's not a program in this scenario, we weren't really sure what the outcomes might be. They're a little bit less clear. And then again, just quickly before we move into discussion, I wanted to throw this slide up to talk about that connection piece, those connective tissues again, because it's in the document, but I don't think we're planning to talk about this until the August 23rd meeting, because it is really intertwined with the planning phase and then also phase 4 and phase 5, which are up on the screen right now. Some of the ideas just briefly that have emerged around this is that there would be a connection to that project implementation phase. Obviously, we would continued refinement of strategies and all of these things that are in this phase would create a pipeline of well-designed, well-thought-out, regionalized, prioritized projects that are competitive for state and federal funding. And that there is also a potential connection to phase 5, monitoring, adaptation, and evaluation. Specifically, we haven't really talked about phase 5 at all, but specifically if phase 5 were included revisiting a plan to update it on some time scale. So like after 10 years, you want to revisit your plan and make sure that it's still accomplishing your goals, or if there's any more information that needed to be included in the plan with the advantage of time. The connection to that phase might be that if your group continued to meet and have this implementation coordination, then you might have a competitive edge to support or to receive state funding to do those plan updates, or you might have sort of automatic access for those plan updates. So that's all I have. And I think if anybody has any questions for us about how we sort of laid this out, we'd be happy to answer them. And then I'll throw it back to Robin to facilitate a discussion around it.
Thanks, Lily. So yeah, questions, clarifying, or ideas from the work group on the planning to action piece. I see you, Jeff. Go ahead.
You're going to wish I never was part of this work group. But I put a question in the chat. I didn't see if there was an answer in it about in kind or kind of what matching looks like here. Do you have a sense?
I think that's a question that this group could help answer. We didn't try to answer that question.
Well, I mean, some people are cash poor, but time rich, and time is money. And so the effort on the planning process and implementation of it should account for that. I mean, depending on how stringent one wants to be about a cash match, you know, certainly that's something we should talk about, but I think that will help self-select some out. And I really don't think you should have state funds match other state funds. So I just, because then unless there's a rationale that I am not aware of, I just don't want to use the same pot of money to help, you know, Peter and Paul both fill their pockets. So that's just, I think that's something we should talk about. I think it's something that is important to have as a barrier reducer.
Thanks, Jeff. Peggy?
So to follow up with Jeff's comment, so skin in the game, I think, is important, but I also want to recognize equity and fairness and environmental justice in this. So the opportunity to have a skin in the game with bodies versus money, and what happened with the last Pace Play group, they all had to go out and write grants to the Ford Family Foundation or the Fred Meyer Group or Oregon Community Foundation in order to get some of that beginning money. And we just need to recognize that some groups don't have the ability to do that. So I just want to center the equity part of this while we're talking about it. But I do agree with Jeff that there should be some kind of skin in the game. But what that is, I can't say.
Okay, thank you.
There was a question in the chat about what kind of funding streams for a prior place-based planning. I'd be interested in knowing that.
What resources it took to get to where you are now in terms of hours and dollars? Did groups do that calculation? I'm sure they did.
Yeah, and I don't have the details, but I know that it was a lot of effort, a lot of time spent just in terms of personal hours. I'm sure Adam knows that all too well, and Anton and others who participated in groups. A number of the groups pursued private philanthropy dollars to help match and keep their capacity moving forward. So there was a let me put it this way: the state resources were insufficient to help these groups by itself. And so there was a lot of effort that these groups needed to engage in, or they needed to downscale their expectations accordingly in terms of having the staffing capacity locally and the facilitation and the other types of resources that are important for these types of intensive planning efforts.
On the other hand, if we had some better criteria, which is what I'm hoping we're going to end up with, perhaps it will be easier for them and a little less time and a little less cost to be able to move this forward. So that's a goal I have in this process.
Thank you. There's actually a number of comments in the chat I feel like we need to just acknowledge. So there's something, Nikki had a reaction to Kimberly's comment. And so what was the comment around local government involvement? Can you clarify, Kimberly, what you were?
There was a comment, I think it was Daniel. I think he said, if there's not local buy-in or local government buy-in, then there should not be planning, something to that effect, not to put words in your mouth, Daniel. And I just was putting a point in the chat that I disagree. The reason for that is, so the integrated water resources strategy calls for place-based planning to meet both in-stream and out-of-stream needs. If there is a county that, is not supportive of meeting both in-stream and out-of-stream needs, there may be groups within that place who want to do planning. So I don't think, we would not say that a screen for funding of planning should be whether there is local buy-in. It's great. It's great. You want the participation, and it would be great if there is support, but I don't think we should knock places out if there is not that support. So what I was trying to get at. I was not trying to offend anyone.
Okay. Kate Fitzpatrick had a response to, I think, to Daniel's question. Oh no, maybe not. Maybe you did. So Kate, do you want to speak to the examples of planning pots? Go ahead.
Sure. I don't have the exact numbers, and ours was, we've been planning for a very long time with different pots of money, but I could probably run the numbers, but it's like lots of hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep these plans and planning efforts moving. The state being one of those, but actually a little bit more of a minor player, frankly, hopefully not in the future, but matching that with all sorts of different foundation grants and federal grants and whatnot. And I'm happy to, walk through what some of those other opportunities are with any of the groups who are looking to match state funds.
Okay. So as kind of a funding model, a match kind of model, you've got some stuff you could share with the group on that. Okay, great. I'm seeing a few head nods. Dan Thorndike had a comment. I'm sorry if I missed it. I don't feel we were able to weigh in on the funding scenarios for what we're calling the pre-planning phase. And you have some thoughts about that based on my belief that quality water planning on every basin in the state would be beneficial, favor full state funding. Without it, I don't see local planning groups being truly broad-based and effective, nor do I see much happening compared to GWEB prior to lottery funding and OWEB with lottery funding. How did the funding piece emerge in the scenarios, Tom and Lily? Because I think it generally gets there, but it's not quite there, right? The sort of different scenarios have different kind of approaches to the investment, or no?
This is an area of needed conversation with this group. So we did not try to put too much detail in that. We, and in very simple terms, in terms of these scenarios that we built to fuel discussion for today, there's a scenario where there's no state investment in this. So we're in some cases like pre-planning, or in this instance with moving a plan to action. From our standpoint, it's kind of preserving the status quo. Or the state does invest, and there's different ways you can do that. You could do it through granting. You could do the legislative direct investments. You can invest in agency capacity to help efforts. So I think that's an area of the threshold in my mind is, does the group see a role for additional state investment in these types of areas? And if so, then how is that funding? What's it used for? How is it used? What are the criteria around it? Is it grant funding? Is it funding for agencies to develop better data resources for groups? I think there's a long list of things that we'll need to start wrestling with. I hope that's helpful.
Okay. I see April's hand up. I just want to acknowledge a couple more comments in the chat. Some concurring with Dan on foundational kind of water planning on a statewide basis should be supported, should be invested in. What that looks like is the next question Tom's saying. So April.
I have a couple of suggestions, I guess. One suggestion is that, because it seems to be coming up repeatedly, that we don't have a shared understanding of vernacular. And this is also a topic where I think in the water world, planning should not be this difficult and it should not be this controversial, but we're still in a space where we have folks that are often on the opposite sides of one another. And so those words are interpreted in different ways. I, for one, could have interpreted earlier comments that were made to imply that the state would be telling communities what to plan rather than the communities themselves, which I don't think was the intention. Lily, you've done an excellent job in trying to put this document together. And I think it's very clear in here, at least as far as how you guys have framed it, that this is a voluntary effort, no matter how you want to phrase and define it. And I think that's the key thing. One of many key things we're probably going to make sure is front and center, that this is a voluntary thing. But then once you go down that path, there are going to be certain things that in getting money from the state, that there's going to be requirements associated with that. And that's where we need to be clear as far as what are you getting and all of those different things. So one suggestion is that we work on having a shared list of terminology, particularly as we're getting into this pre-planning and different components here. And particularly if you're going to pull us on it, which I'm not necessarily a fan of, that we have more specificity on what it is that we're asking folks to have feedback on, so that hopefully there's a more shared understanding of what we're talking about. And I suspect that some terms may need to be discussed further. I'm on at least 3 different subgroups, so presumably one of those will be talking about some of these things. But my second suggestion would be both because we're running out of time, and also it just, I think, would be helpful, but I want to make sure that it's something that Tom and Lily would find helpful. Can we provide comments on this framework and just get that to you guys, and whether that is to Lily or to Robin, or however you guys want to handle that? And as far as having that level of feedback, as far as, you know, do you think that the state should be providing feedback at this point? And maybe you don't want feedback on the document as a whole, maybe you just want feedback on certain components, but I'm a little frustrated about how our time was spent today. And so I would just offer that up as that may be a good way for us to give Lily and the department some feedback. And then the different groups that are already scheduled to meet between now and September could hopefully hash that out a bit more, or identify some of the areas that need further discussion and development. Because I really do feel a lot of what we've done today hasn't been so much that there's disagreements about the planning stuff as a whole, so much as there's disagreements or confusion over the vernacular or what it means if the state does this, or if the community does X, Y, or Z. So those are just 2 suggestions, and would appreciate if that's something that the department would be amenable to, or exactly how you guys are, if not, how you're planning on moving forward past this document and getting our feedback in a way that's hopefully helpful.
Well, let's start with the first suggestion, April, which is like figuring out a glossary of terms, I think is maybe a way of putting it. I think it would be really helpful if you or others could kind of initiate what that is, because I guess the department, just for us, so for them to know which terms you feel are continuing to be kind of a miss, you know, that people have different impressions of what those terms are, instead of the intent of how you structure the system. So that might be something that, if people are feeling strongly that we need to have kind of a glossary of terms, what terms, which words, which things do we need to kind of make sure we address? Because this, I think you're right, it keeps coming up when we talk about assumptions, we talk about essential elements, we talk about some of these forming principles. Every time it comes forward, it turns into we don't agree on the terms. We're not talking necessarily about we don't agree on the intention. So I think just understanding what terms need to be like really explicitly clarified so that people are having the same conversation would be really valuable feedback for the department and for the process. On the second question, I won't answer for WRD on how helpful it would be for people to offer comments back on the document itself. All I will say is that that wasn't the intention that this would be something that we take and sort of red line and get to a place of agreement on the document itself. It was meant to see what work needs to be developed and who from the work group is willing to step up to work on it. So that's kind of that's a piece, and WRD, you weigh in for sure on what would be a helpful next step to help you do some refinement on these pieces from today.
Well, we're trying to help the group move the ball down the field, to use a sports metaphor. As we're hearing, there is, we don't all have the same understanding of what different terms mean. And we've got to sift through that. And so whatever the best way for us to go through that, in most time effective way for us to do that, I'm all ears in terms of how to do it. I worry a little bit with this group that if we start to define things and develop a glossary, that we could spend a full meeting debating over the definition of those terms. I'm happy to do that, but I think we need to be mindful of the energy that this group can bring to bear on the details. So I don't have a perfect answer on how to keep us moving, but my interest is to help this group start to narrow its focus and hone its focus on this system that you're looking to build out recommendations around. Mm-hmm. And so if there are, I don't know if there's an easy path to do this. And I have a lot of respect for the folks in this group. There are a lot of really good minds and good thinkers, but we're not all, originating from the same thought space. And I think that's just a challenge that you have with a group of this size, and with the different backgrounds and interests that people are bringing to the table.
I guess, April, do you have a suggestion of how to go about figuring out like that issue of people not using the same terms or not having the same understanding of terms?
Well, I think the one that is very clear from the conversation today is that we don't have a shared understanding of what pre-planning or step zero or whatever you want to call that would be. I think if we had time to go further, I think the other area would be on the implementation, moving plan to action. What is that? And maybe it's more of a bucket of things than it is trying to define it specifically. I think about comments Oriana and others made earlier about it. This is to put my own words on it, it's a more organic thing, and it's a little less, it's not linear. It is something that's going to have different kind of flows to it depending on where a community is or a place and how they're approaching this issue. So I think I don't think it's a long list, but I also am just thinking of other efforts that I've been a part of where you do at some point have a list of terms to make sure that you have that shared understanding. Also being specific that if you're looking at legislative language, there are existing definitions and terms that are already out there, for example, related to integrated water resources planning or other chunks of mouthfuls. But if aside from that, maybe a different way to approach it would be to ask people to go through the document and maybe give us further direction, but identify maybe where anybody on here undoubtedly could have a question about, well, what did WRD mean when they wrote that up? What exactly is in that? If we're looking at, I'll just randomly pick out something, what is the level of readiness to engage in formal planning? Well, what does that mean? I'm not saying that specifically for me, but I think it might be good for us to zero in on for all of us, because as somebody else pointed out, we're trying to create something here as a group. Mm-hmm. Recognizing that anybody else can create something too, and we need to be recognizing that the further this thing goes on, the more other groups and entities will come together and come up with their own concepts And there's nothing here we're going to do to prevent that. But to maximize what Lily's put together and the time that the department's already put together towards this, can we give you some specific feedback and ask questions about, because I'm sure I'm not the only one that is kind of noticing that there's a difference in how certain folks are talking about things, and it's not really clear to me what I'm necessarily being asked to support or what I'm being asked to say, no, this needs to be fleshed out more. Well, if I don't even know what it is, how do I know whether it needs more detail, or Lord knows if I want to volunteer to work on it. So hopefully that helped.
Thank you.
If I could, Robin, just weigh in just briefly. Thank you, April. I appreciate you expanding on that. I actually do think that we made a lot of progress today, and the example that you used around the confusion around pre-planning versus planning, that was a very helpful conversation, because I think what I heard from a lot of folks is we need to be thinking about this more as an integrated system that we're developing. So I felt like we had some takeaways from that we can build off of. Still, that conversation happened, but I do think it was positive. And I think identifying those gaps, raising those questions helps us move down the line. I really think that, I think we're in a better position to provide more details for the group to respond to. If members of the group want to provide individual feedback, I think I'm okay with that, but I guess I would say you got to turn it around really quickly so that we have time to look at it and be able to incorporate it into our thought process in developing the next round of draft materials for the group. And I would also recommend that it be shared with the full group so that everyone has a chance to see what's being generated by others.
Okay. Oriana and Nikki.
Yeah, I do just want to name one, to your question, Robin, term that I think has come up a lot, and that there is a certain amount of tension around that I think is important to define. And I think actually the community engagement group may be able to be helpful with that. And that is the idea of community and local. And like, does community just mean local? And what does local mean? Does it mean government? Does it mean leaders? Does it mean some combination of the above? Does community include groups from outside? And I think that came up in the place-based planning presentations we had a few sessions ago, of that kind of discussion of like, who gets to be at the table and what is their value and who is impacted. In the work that Verde does, we think about like community as who's impacted by a particular issue. And more often also who's impacted, but who also doesn't have a voice in the process typically, and who may be impacted and have unintended consequences impact them. But wasn't able to say, hey, this is going to be an unintended consequence that's coming. That's kind of how we define it. But I think it can be defined in a number of different ways. And that idea of community leadership too can be defined in a number of different ways. Does it mean that it's local leadership? Does it mean that it's statewide leadership? And I think the honest answer for a good process is that it has to come from both directions. And I think that's some of the tension we're getting here, is that there are statewide groups who feel like they've been shut out of certain processes, and there are local groups who feel like they've been disenfranchised by state groups. And that might explain some of the tension that's come about from the proposal that was put forward that we haven't heard from yet, that it felt like statewide groups coming through and stifling information. And I can understand and acknowledge that. But I think we have to kind of come from both directions to make sure that local voices have a voice in the process, and that their goals and values are put forward, but also that the state has some voice in a process that they're supporting to make sure that it meets their goals. Like to April's point, if you're going down a path, there may have to be certain sideboards that are included. So I think like that tension is something that I think is important to surface, and maybe the community engagement group, as we define communities and define community-led, because this tension has come up in that space. It's important to kind of just continue to sit in that. And maybe it's not just defining terms, but also when these tensions come up, naming them. And we don't have to go down the deep roads of history, but I think they also come from a certain place and past processes. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as well, that everybody's bringing what words have meant in past spaces to them, and sometimes where harm has been done. So I think like to the extent that we can try to unpack that may make this process feel like we're able to use some of the same language. And we don't always have to use the exact same language, but I think still trying to disaggregate where that is coming from is a useful way to make sure that we're trying to get on the same page where we can, and there may be places where we can't.
Thank you. Nikki?
Yeah, taking what everybody said today, I think there's a few different themes I'm hearing that might be useful that we could explore at a future meeting. And essentially, like, I think it does seem so far that most people are very interested in extending the place-based planning program, but there may be some tweaks that we need to acknowledge or include in that. Using the term readiness really helped me a lot. Think about, I think pre-planning is just maybe a bad phrase for me, but what I think would be helpful at the next meeting is that it sounds like from the people that went through the process, there were certain things that if they had had a guidance document from the department and they had ready to go, like, here's the things you should do before and be ready for when you apply for money. And that's just pretty standard grant application process. And that's something I think the department could do from lessons learned and just update it. I do think a governance charter like Anton recommended should be part of planning, because I think everybody around the table should be part of that and not just the people applying for the grant. So I would move the governance chartering into the planning process and make that like your first step of your process so that everybody at the table agrees to the governance of the conversation. And I think those things will get us where we needed to go. If people really want to pursue funding for readiness, I think that's going to be a challenge, but it's not something people could do that. But I think that would sell better. But I think legislators are just going to be like, hey, get your ducks in a row. We're giving you state money. And there's some things you just need to get your groups together on. And here's what you need to be prepared for. And then the governance move that and maybe just take a pulse of this group. I'm getting a sense people are interested in continuing moving this forward. And I think, Commissioner Magruder was just looking at a proposal and what we talked to her about, just continuing place-based planning. There's a lot of themes that this group has talked about. So I don't think that's something people that need to be really that threatened by. I think that's something that we could be open to as well. But, I do think there's going to be differences that happen per basin. And the department's just going to have to provide some leadership in those situations. When someone calls, like April was saying, says, I don't understand what that means. So, but there is going to need to be a process. Like you can't have, like I appreciated Oriana's comments, if you have 30 statewide organizations, representing the public, but in reality, several people are representing their fundraisers, not the whole public, not the local communities' ratepayers. There needs to be kind of that balanced interest between statewide interests and the local community. So I just think you might have to design that differently for each basin based on the makeup of the basin. But I think overall, it sounds like people want to move forward and getting rid of the expiration of the place-based and continuing funding. Maybe we could focus on that a little bit. The department could work on here's the things you should do to be ready. And I think Anton's suggestion of governance and chartering being really important. I think that should be in planning, because if you do that ahead, you aren't going to get buy-in. But I think setting the table, as Ariana said, I think might need to be a deliberate exercise led by the department as well.
Great, thank you. All right. So we're going to have to go through some housekeeping items just to get us on the track for the next step. So I'm going to kind of stop the conversation on the framework document and talk about what the next steps are. So one, let's address how do people get their ideas, individual ideas into this process? That's been a process concern and question that we need to talk about for a moment. One thing that's been sort of floating back and forth with the coordinating committee about the right kind of track for that. And I'll just speak to what I heard in that conversation with the coordinating committee, and on the heels, we had some follow-up emailing. So coordinating committee members, if something strikes you as different than what you recall or different than what you felt like was important, please speak up. But here's what I'm tracking. yes, there should be a clear avenue for individuals to, or small groups of work group members to bring ideas forward. That's the whole point of this process, is to get your ideas into the mix and then use this forum space, which is, you know, set up to be a collaborative consensus seeking space, to see where you can help, you know, bring people's ideas together into something that might be a joint recommendation or aligned thinking and proposal. So it may initiate from one individual, but then the lift is for you to bring it in and see if you can sort of garner some support or find some flexibility where, you know, it's a collaborative endeavor. And so having a clear channel for that, what we generally agreed to in the coordinating committee was, from this moment forward, we'll have a standing agenda item that's for ad hoc ideas to come forward. So it's not work that's happening in a task group. It's not kind of input that the WRD team is getting back on anything that they're producing. It's really kind of a separate, and it's a distinct thing that says, I have this idea I want to bring forward on behalf of, you know, my interest group, and I want to share it with the work group to see if we can get some traction. So Margaret, you may be the first one out the gate to do that. But so going forward, we'll have a standing agenda item for those things. A couple of sort of like process considerations around that would be that you make sure it's clear who it's coming from. Apropos of the operating protocols that you all agreed to, make sure that it goes to the working group first, if you hope for it to become a work group endorsed idea. So to make sure that that comes forward to the group before it gets sort of sent out to the world. Not that you don't have the right, and absolutely shouldn't be kind of sounding board with you know, your kind of thought partners or your advisory people out in the world, but that the idea itself, especially if it's, you know, something that you feel strongly this group should work on together, bring it to the work group first. And then the third thing was to let us know at least, and make sure that anything you have in writing gets sent, we're able to send out to the group at least a week in advance. That's kind of the general thing that we're working with WRD and any other groups that are working on products, that it's a week or more in advance, so people have a chance to see it before it arrives and before they're being asked to discuss it. So those were just kind of a few of the themes around this particular piece of the process. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I'm wondering, thank you, Robin. I'm wondering if you could send out, like after this meeting or every month, like when all the work groups are meeting, and send links and stuff. Because I'm guessing there's some other folks like myself who just can't commit to like many, many months of multiple work groups. But if we knew what was on their agenda, we might want to come to a specific meeting.
Great. Yes. And now that things are really kind of evolving in that way, we can commit to doing that on a regular basis. Right now, we have one established task group, which is the community and public engagement. But yeah, there's now likely going to be at least one or two more coming out. So we'll do that. What was the chat? Somebody just put something in the chat. Oh, and a time limit. So yeah, so that was the other thing, is we'll need to have some flexibility around the how much time is on the agenda for that ad hoc piece, but for everyone to be mindful to sort of limit yourselves to something that can be you know, that's mindful of like the use of the rest of the space, particularly if you're going to continue to ask WRD to kind of evolve these other products on your behalf. That'll be an important thing that we have to make sure we have space for. So yeah, just finding that balance. All right, so that invitation stands to anyone. Please reach out to the facilitation team if you have something that you want to bring forward. Our next meeting is scheduled for August 23rd. It's a half day, so it's 9 to 12 over Zoom. The agenda for that is generally will be WRD presenting scenarios for the planning phase of the system. I think a little bit of refinement based on today's conversation is we may end up kind of bringing some of the readiness stuff into that conversation. I can see that potentially being a place where we sort of put all of that together, but make sure it's clear that this readiness part kind of has the pieces that we talked about today, and whoever signed up to help WRD, that we work with you on that particular piece. The other thing that'll come in August will be any updates or refinements, like I said, to the pre-planning or the plan to action if they're ready. If they're not ready, we'll make sure we will absolutely have space for a second iteration at the September 6th meeting. And then the third item for August 23rd would be opportunity for ad hoc ideas that have been initiated from a work group member to be considered. September is another fuller meeting, September 6th. DEQ, as Jennifer Weigel tipped out, will be bringing a presentation and engaging some conversation around the data management system project. I probably am getting that term, speaking of terms, I might be getting that wrong, but she'll be bringing something forward to talk with you about. At that point, the task group, community and public engagement, will be bringing a draft product forward for you to review and deliberate on. Any follow-up on pre-planning or plan to action refinements, and again, opportunity for ad hoc ideas that were initiated from work group member to be considered. One question that was asked by a member of the coordinating committee was, what happens if I can't attend the meeting? As a work group member, can I do written comments? And I think the short answer is absolutely, we want to hear from everyone. I think our team and WRD need to set up a clear, and we'll work with the coordinating committee on this too, to set up a clear way for that to happen. So it's both constructive, isn't super chaotic. So it's actually like streamlined well enough that it has meaning, so that if you're going to take the time to provide some comments, that you're not commenting on a document that maybe isn't something that needs to be commented on. So we'll be really clear about that process. But yes, if you have to miss a meeting, and we want to make sure that your ideas and thoughts are in the mix as we go. I'm almost done, Kate. I'll get to you in just one sec. The other, just teeing up for the future sessions, we have October 4th, which is a regular 11 to 3. October 20th is a reserved shorter meeting, 2 to 3 hours via Zoom. November 1st is a regular 11 to 3. And then December 6th is a full one. Now, some of these have been flagged to be in person. We are currently slated and able to go to the Mid-Coast for the September 6th meeting. That being said, there's a lot of stuff that's going on that people are feeling not necessarily like they can make it. So we need to kind of get a threshold question answered about how many people can actually commit to doing it in person. And if we don't get enough people, we will just go to all Zoom, because I think the difficult and important deliberations that you're doing right now, let's either all be on Zoom or all be together in the room, is my thinking at this juncture. More on that, we'll follow up on that this week. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, and I might have missed this, apologies if I did, but I know the state was going to take another crack at the pre-planning. We didn't have a lot of discussion on the plan to action. I'm wondering where that's at as far as next steps, or if the state's just going to use the existing one or take another crack at that, or what.
Any thought? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, we're happy to take another crack at that, and I do think it needs more refinement. We did get a little bit of feedback today, but I know we didn't have the depth of conversation on that point, and we'll need to have it as a group. I think it's an important area that really is not something that the state has involvement in at a meaningful level right now. So I think it's going to be an important conversation. So we'll be looking for ways for us to be able to provide some additional fodder, I guess, for the group to be able to react to help foster the conversation going forward.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, and based on, we did put the survey out after the June meeting. This was one that rose to a top kind of priority of topic. And there were some people who indicated a willingness or interest in working on that. So we may end up just putting an invitation out to do a smaller group on that piece too. But I feel like I need to talk to the technical staff at OWRD to see if maybe they have enough to go on and feel like they need another bite at the apple to bring back to you in later. So that's a TBD, but we do have kind of a short list of folks who indicated at least earlier that they'd be interested. And I know Kate, even in today's chat, you suggested you might be interested in working on that piece as well. Thank you. All right. Just looking to see if there are any other housekeeping items. Can I just ask, are there other folks who are planning to bring some ideas separately forward for the next meeting? That'd be helpful if we kind of had a signal of that now, because that will help us when we're thinking about the agenda for August 23rd or September 6th. So Margaret, I'm going to ask you quickly, are you, based on all of today's conversation, are you planning to bring a concept forward individually for next time?
I would be happy to bring my concept forward.
And what about others? Do we have other folks who are thinking, I've actually got something waiting in the wings I'd like to bring forward to the group? Kimberly?
I don't have something that I am going to bring to the group, but I'm a little stuck on the process piece. So Margaret will bring her piece to the group in September. But then there was the interchange between Margaret and Tom about the next draft iteration from the department. And so it seems to me process-wise, it makes more sense for the group to see that before it's enveloped into a state document. So I guess I'm just curious how others feel about that, or what the process is there, because I think, if Water Watch were to bring something forward and it made it into like the next draft without discussion by the group, I think that might raise concerns. And I don't know what's in Margaret's I'm just saying as a process point, that seemed a little odd to me. I don't know if anyone agrees.
That's my question as well.
Okay, so what's the sequencing here, or what's the difference between the two channels?
Yeah, what's the sequencing? Because if the work group is going to be seeing it at first instance in September, yet presumably the department is coming out with another draft document for that meeting or before that meeting, it doesn't seem process-wise appropriate to include that proposal in the state's document without first talking about it as a group. That's the sequencing problem that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think that is a distinction for sure, Kimberly, that either you're willing to sign up to work with the department on making refinements on behalf of the group to the work that the group's been discussing, or you're compelled to bring a separate and distinct idea forward that you're kind of standing on that you'd like to have. And so those would be two separate products, if you will, and two separate agenda items. Yeah. And that goes for everyone. That's just for anyone that wants to bring in a kind of an idea forward that's not an evolution of thought based on the work group's discussion. It would be a separate agenda item. It'd be under that ad hoc piece. I hope that clarified it for you and for Bob. You had that question too. Yeah, okay. Oriana?
What I was hearing in Kimberly's comment, maybe, and forgive me if I'm interpreting incorrectly here, is kind of the like, how do we make sure we have time to review or engage with something? And so it might be helpful to just set like a deadline before the next meeting by which like proposals need to be in. And then maybe that's also, they get sent out at the same time as the WRD proposal. Because I would not assume that a proposal is intended to be incorporated into what WRD is putting forward. Someone else might have a completely different idea or something that's complementary, or it may need to stand on its own. So I think trying to give people an equal opportunity to look at all different content, including the new WRD proposal, but allowing some time for review would be helpful. I don't know if that made sense, but I think like that deadline, that content, that pre-review before the meeting, I think will help the discussion to kind of think about things in context with each other, but not assume that something is already incorporating into WRD.
Yeah, I guess what I said earlier, Oriana, and I'll repeat it, is anyone that has something they want to put forward for the agenda, you send it at least a week in advance and it gets distributed out to the full work group. And if it's a separate item and the WRD piece also will be distributed at least a week in advance. That's their commitment to this, the deadline as well. So it's the same deadline. And it's true, it's possible that people get stuff at the same time. And I guess what I would ask of work group members, anyone that's developing something, to consider whether or not taking that sort of crosswalk approach of, okay, I have this idea I'm developing. Let me crosswalk it to see if it's starting to emerge or align within the product that WRD is holding the pen on. And if so, then great. Maybe you come in and basically just reinforce some of those ideas that are coming forward. But we also have to recognize that there may be ideas that aren't emerging, that the work group isn't sort of holding space for. And if you have an idea that's distinct, there's a channel for that as well. And I think Peggy also asked that we be mindful of how we're using the time. So if we had 10 competing or different ideas coming forward, and you're also being asked to work on the WRD piece, and it's not WRD's piece, it's just the product they're holding the pen on, just to be really, really clear. It's your product eventually, but it's them holding the pen because you've designated them to hold the pen as the technical piece on this. So I just ask that everyone be mindful of that time, that if you're really truly working in a collaborative spirit, you are looking for those synergies, you are looking for those areas of alignment, and you are looking to try to integrate your needs and interests with everyone else's. So I would just in principle, I would say that's a really important thing for everyone to be mindful of. And I also think that it wouldn't be fair for us to say you just can't bring your idea forward unless the work group has said it's their idea. That sort of defeats the purpose of the collaborative space as well. So Kimberly and Margaret. Oh.
Although I firmly believe that OWRD will perhaps accept all of the concepts that I have put together, I'm thinking that maybe they might not. And so if there are things that they don't think fit into their program, then I'm happy to bring those up, because as I've developed this concept, I think my ideas are pretty good, but you guys might not, and OWRD might not. So, I don't think that we'll take a lot of time to rediscuss things. If they go into the OWRD plan, okay. If they don't, I'll bring them up when I'm presenting my ad hoc thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, Peggy.
So just really quickly, I want to reiterate what you just said. The WRD product is a product of our work, and they simply interpreted that work and tried their best to put it on paper. I want to take the onus off of WRD from this. They simply listened to what we had to say and tried to come up with a product for which we could all work on and try to refine. I just think that's just really important. It's not WRD's product.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy.
Point taken. Thank you. I didn't, but I'd love to, give Tom a little bit of a bad time and let him carry most of the burden.
Go ahead, Kimberly.
So I think Margaret's comments, again, I think there's confusion about the next draft from the WRD. So as I understand it, Margaret, your concept will go to the group in September. It will not be incorporated into Tom's next version. And so So I think we are expecting you to present in September, not present if Tom doesn't include. In other words, we're having this, I feel like we're having a circular conversation. I just want to make sure we're all clear on the next steps, that they're two separate things. The department is bringing the pen forward, as Peggy said, for the work group. Margaret has an idea she's going to propose. Those would not be subsumed into the department, into the group concept until we have had a conversation.
Yeah, I think she looks like she's in full agreement on that. And obviously the WRD responsibility and ours in service to all of you is to make sure that we're showing the work along the way. So everyone's tracking the changes, everyone's tracking where it's coming from, everyone's tracking how these things are evolving based on the conversations. So with that, we are at time. I just want to, again, Adam saying great conversation today, everyone. Kate, thank you, Lily, and all for giving something to dig into. Oriana, thanks to Lily for the incredibly hard work that went into the framework. And everyone hopefully dug into the content and the conversations, but kind of wanted to make sure that she emphasized the gratitude to Lily for putting this all together and trying her best to do right by the group and be responsive to the group's conversations to date. So with that, we'll keep on keeping on, and we will do some very quick follow-up communication out with next steps, invitations to join conversations and task groups. We'll send out a schedule of events per Daniel's suggestion, and then we'll also provide some communication about what are we asking for feedback on, whether that's between meetings or at the next meeting. So just I really appreciate everyone bringing some, I think, very valuable thinking and voice to this conversation today. And I think WRD, it sounds like you have a lot to now kind of build from, and hopefully recruit some work group members to support you in helping to build those things, because this product is only as good as the work group owns it, right? It's nothing without the work group sort of owning this, whatever it is that evolves. So it's really up to all of you to decide and compel the work forward. And WRD is here to be a really strong technical support to all of that. So again, Lily, just appreciate the work that you've done and look forward to seeing the next round. And appreciate all of you. We'll see you for sure over Zoom on August 23rd, and we'll send out a schedule after today. Thanks all. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.